I walked into my son's engagement dinner wearing my absolute best vintage suit. The bride took one look at my calloused hands, turned to her mother, and smirked. Oh, look, they even invited the handyman to clean up. I stood completely frozen in the grand foyer. I was just about to turn around and walk out the door when my son grabbed my arm. He pulled me close and whispered quietly, "Dad, trust me. Just for tonight, play along. It is time for us to get our revenge." 2 hours later, the bride started screaming in front of all her high society guests. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. My name is Albert Gaines. I am 69 years old, and what happened that night dismantled an entire family of frauds. The Wellington Country Club smelled of expensive floral arrangements and old money. I handed my coat to the valet, suddenly hyper-aware of my gray suit. I bought it 10 years ago. It was impeccably tailored, but it lacked the modern sheen of the designer labels surrounding me. I stepped into the foyer. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh light on the polished marble floor. I spotted my son, Corey, immediately. He stood tall in a sharp black tuxedo, looking handsome and confident. He was conversing with his future in-laws, the Hastings family. I took a deep breath and stepped forward to greet the people who were about to become my family. Megan Hastings. My future daughter-in-law stood beside Corey. She wore an elaborate white silk dress that fit perfectly. Her blonde hair fell in waves across her shoulders. As I approached her, eyes darted toward me with disapproval. Her cold blue gaze swept over my worn leather shoes and traveled up to my hands. She stared at my rough knuckles with clear disgust. She leaned into her mother Victoria, a woman dripping in diamonds and arrogance. "Oh, look," Megan whispered loudly enough for her voice to carry directly to my ears. "They even invited the handyman to clean up after us." Victoria let out a short, mocking laugh. She raised her champagne flute to her lips, not bothering to hide her disdain. She looked at me as if I had crawled out of a sewer to ruin their evening. The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened with a familiar ache. I had spent my life maintaining my dignity in rooms exactly like this one. People saw my brown skin and my calloused hands and decided my worth before I spoke a single word. I did not want to cause a scene. I did not want to humiliate my son on the most important night of his life. I stopped in my tracks. I turned toward the heavy glass doors, ready to walk out into the night and disappear. A strong hand clamped down hard on my forearm. I turned around, expecting to see a security guard asking me to leave. It was Corey. His face was devoid of the usual warmth he reserved for me. His eyes were unreadable, cold, and sharp like shattered glass. He did not look at Megan. He kept his gaze locked on mine. "Dad, do not walk out that door," Corey said. His voice was a low command that brooked no argument. "Corey," I began, ready to tell him I would never stay where I was so clearly despised. He squeezed my arm tighter, cutting off my protest. "I heard what she said, Dad. I hear everything she says. Trust me. I know who she is, and I know what her family is trying to do tonight. Just play along. Be the poor handyman she thinks you are. We are going to expose them all." I stared at my boy in complete shock. He had always been so brilliant, so incredibly driven to succeed. I assumed love had blinded him to the Hastings family and their thinly veiled racism. I assumed he was too infatuated with Megan to notice her deeply manipulative nature. I was entirely wrong. Corey was not blind at all. He was simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I looked down at my hands. The skin was rough, scarred heavily from decades of laying bricks and fixing frozen pipes in the brutal winters of South Chicago. Those hands had bled to pay for Corey's tuition, his textbooks, and his first small apartment in the city. I had worked grueling double shifts in the freezing cold so my son could sit in warm classrooms and learn how to write software. But there was a massive secret I kept from him. I kept it from absolutely everyone. Those brutal years of contracting work eventually led to buying up cheap, abandoned lots. Those empty lots turned into small commercial buildings which slowly turned into towering, high-rise developments. Over 30 years, I quietly built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire from the ground up. I hid my wealth behind anonymous trusts and corporate holding companies because I wanted Corey to build his own legacy without relying on my massive shadow. I wanted him to have the relentless fire of a hungry man. He succeeded launching a medical tech startup that was now worth an absolute fortune. Megan only saw the dirt of my past. She had absolutely no idea she was looking at a man who could easily buy this entire country club with a single phone call. Megan finally noticed Corey talking to me in the corner. She plastered a sickeningly sweet smile on her face and glided over to us in her expensive gown. Her eyes completely bypassed my face and focused entirely on Corey. "Darling, the dinner is starting," she said, placing a highly possessive hand flat on Corey's chest. She then turned her attention to me, her smile tightening into a forced grimace. "Albert, we found a special spot just for you tonight. We know how crowded these big tables can get, and we wanted you to be comfortable." She pointed gracefully across the massive, brightly lit ballroom. My assigned seat was a tiny, poorly decorated table shoved directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the busy kitchen. It was a table clearly meant for the exhausted waitstaff or the coat check attendants to take their breaks. It was the ultimate, undeniable gesture of highly cruel disrespect and blatant, intentional public exclusion. Corey did not flinch. He looked at the miserable table, then looked back at Megan and smiled warmly. "That is incredibly thoughtful of you, Megan. My dad prefers the quiet anyway." "Right, Dad. He was forcing me directly into the fire. He was making me swallow the public humiliation whole so the trap could snap shut." I looked at the kitchen doors, then at Megan's triumphant face. I nodded slowly. "Yes, thank you so much, Megan. That table is absolutely perfect." I walked slowly toward my exile, ready to watch my son burn their fake kingdom to the ground. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased when Victoria Hastings raised two perfectly manicured fingers. Like a trained hound, the head waiter emerged from the kitchen doors, bypassing my small, forgotten table. He carried a heavy silver platter directly to the center of the room. It did not hold another round of vintage champagne or caviar. It held a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark leather portfolio. Victoria gestured for the waiter to place the heavy portfolio directly in front of my son. The entire room fell into a suffocating, judgmental silence. The cheerful chatter of high society elites evaporated in an instant, replaced by a tense anticipation. Everyone stared at Corey like wolves watching cornered prey. My chest tightened as I recognized the trap springing shut. Victoria smoothed her silk dress and leaned across the table. Her voice carried a sickly sweet tone meant to mask the venom beneath it. She declared that trust is the foundation of any successful marriage, and her family valued transparency above all else. Charles nodded in agreement, taking a slow sip of his expensive scotch. Megan placed her hand softly over Corey's arm. Her blue eyes suddenly welled up with perfectly timed tears. She looked at him with an expression of pure, calculated vulnerability. I watched from the shadows of the kitchen doors, gripping the edge of my cheap tablecloth. I knew exactly what was inside that leather portfolio. Megan wiped a glistening tear from her cheek. She spoke in a trembling whisper that somehow projected across the silent room, commanding everyone's attention. She told Corey her parents were simply worried about her future in a volatile world. She claimed she needed to feel secure to know they were building a life together as equal partners. Corey gently opened the leather cover. It was an extreme prenuptial agreement. The bold print on the first page outlined a non-negotiable demand. Megan required an immediate, irrevocable transfer of 50% of Corey's medical tech startup upon the legal certification of their marriage. She sobbed quietly, pressing her face against his shoulder. She claimed she did not care about money, but this gesture would prove his commitment to her family. The audacity of her performance made my blood boil. I clenched my calloused hands under the table. Corey had spent the last 5 years pouring his sweat and blood into developing groundbreaking surgical software. He slept on the floor of his office. He ate instant noodles while debugging code until dawn. Now this woman wearing a dress that cost more than my first house wanted half of his life's work handed to her on a silver platter. Her tears were a flawless weapon of emotional manipulation. She sobbed about the terrifying uncertainty of the modern economy and how a true man protects his bride. Charles added his booming voice to the performance, stating a man of Corey's caliber should have no problem securing his daughter's peace of mind. They were cornering him in front of their wealthiest friends, using public pressure to force his hand. I knew exactly why they were moving with such desperate speed tonight. Just last month, Corey's startup had secured a massive federal medical contract. The government deal immediately skyrocketed the company's valuation to $40 million. The ink on the contract was barely dry before Megan escalated the wedding plans. Over the last 8 months, I watched her systematically isolate Corey from his entire support network. She manufactured dramatic arguments to cut off his closest college friends. She scheduled mandatory weekend getaways to prevent him from attending his company's board meetings. She relentlessly gaslit him until his world revolved around her and her parents. She was a master architect of isolation, specifically maneuvering him into this vulnerable position to extract maximum wealth. I could not sit quietly anymore. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. I stepped out from the shadows of the kitchen doors and walked toward the center table, feeling the burning gaze of 100 wealthy strangers judging my every step. I let my shoulders slump, playing the role of the uneducated, terrified blue-collar father perfectly. I grabbed Corey's shoulder, keeping my voice shaky and fraught with manufactured panic. I begged him not to sign the paper. I reminded him how hard he worked for that company. I pleaded with him to talk to a lawyer first, to not give away the only thing he had built. Megan dropped the fragile, weeping bride persona instantly. Her head snapped toward me. Her blue eyes flared with naked, vicious rage. She slammed her hand flat against the table. She aggressively ordered me to step back and keep my mouth shut. She sneered at my worn suit, declaring that a common laborer had no right to interfere in high-level corporate negotiations. She told the entire room that a man who fixed toilets for a living could never comprehend the complexities of generational wealth or legal partnerships. Her voice dripped with raw classist disgust. She demanded I return to my corner and let the adults handle their business. Corey did not defend me. He did not raise his voice at her blatant disrespect. Instead, he looked at my face and gave a barely perceptible nod. He turned his attention back to Megan, his face softening into an expression of deep, warm affection. He smiled brightly at her, picked up the heavy gold fountain pen resting on the platter, and signed his name on the dotted line without a single second of hesitation. Megan's vicious scowl instantly transformed into a radiant, triumphant grin. She snatched the signed document off the table before the ink could dry. She immediately pulled her sleek phone from her clutch and frantically typed out a text message. She hit send with a satisfied smirk, notifying her hidden accomplices that the asset transfer was secured. The trap she built had seemingly worked flawlessly. Exactly 1 minute after Megan sent her victorious text message, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung open. The country club manager marched directly toward the head table. His face was devoid of the usual fawning respect he showed the Hastings family. He carried a black leather billfold. He bypassed Corey and stood firmly next to Charles. The manager loudly announced that the club required immediate upfront payment for the evening's extravagant festivities. The final bill totaled exactly $30,000. Charles laughed heartily, projecting immense confidence to his wealthy peers. He reached into his tailored breast pocket, pulled out a gleaming platinum credit card, and tossed it onto the silver tray. The manager inserted the platinum card into his portable terminal. The machine processed for a tense second, then emitted a loud, sharp, undeniable beep that echoed through the quiet room. The digital screen flashed a bright red error. The platinum card was brutally declined. Charles frowned, flustered by the sudden public embarrassment. He pulled a second card from his wallet and shoved it toward the manager. He insisted his bank flagged the transaction for security reasons. The manager swiped the second card with a rigid expression. The machine beeped again, flashing the exact same red error message. Victoria's smug smile vanished. The machine emitted a second loud rejection tone. The sharp sound sliced through the heavy silence of the Wellington Country Club ballroom. The club manager maintained a rigid posture, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. He pulled the platinum card from the terminal, wiped the magnetic strip with a pristine white cloth, and firmly swiped it a third time. The terminal screen illuminated the room with a harsh crimson glow. Insufficient funds. The digital words were impossible to misinterpret. The surrounding guests, previously captivated by the romantic spectacle of the prenuptial agreement, now leaned in with ravenous curiosity. Whispers erupted across the tables like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. The elite members of high society thrived on the sudden misfortune of their peers. Charles Hastings stared at the small electronic device as if it had physically struck him. A deep, angry flush crept up his neck and quickly consumed his face. The self-proclaimed multi-millionaire import-export king was suddenly exposed over a dinner tab. He let out a loud, forced laugh that completely lacked humor. He violently snatched the platinum card back from the manager's hands. He loudly declared that the banking system was experiencing a massive technical failure. He claimed his wealth management team was likely updating his international portfolio and had temporarily frozen his secondary accounts for security purposes. The excuse was incredibly rehearsed, but the whispering crowd did not seem convinced. Victoria clutched her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes darting nervously around the room, desperately trying to salvage their pristine public image. Charles turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward my son. He plastered a sickeningly warm smile on his face, attempting to regain control of the narrative. He clapped Corey heavily on the shoulder. He suggested that since Corey had just officially joined the Hastings family by signing the legal agreement, he should cover this minor inconvenience. Charles framed it as a grand gesture of goodwill, a symbolic step into his new role as a provider for Megan. He practically ordered my son to pay the $30,000 bill to save them from this ridiculous banking error. Corey executed his role with absolute perfection. He widened his eyes, projecting a flawless mixture of eager compliance and slight embarrassment. He immediately reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He assured Charles that he was incredibly honored to handle the evening's expenses. He pulled out a heavy black leather wallet and retrieved his primary debit card. He handed the dark plastic to the club manager with an apologetic smile. Megan exhaled a massive sigh of relief. She quickly smoothed her silk dress and glared at the whispering guests, daring them to continue doubting her family's absolute supremacy. The manager inserted Corey's debit card into the portable terminal. The elegant ballroom held its collective breath. The machine processed the transaction for a long, agonizing second. A loud, sharp beep pierced the quiet room. The digital screen flashed bright red. Declined. The silence that followed was absolute. The club manager frowned deeply. He looked down at the glowing screen, then looked directly at Corey. He stated clearly that the card had been rejected by the issuing bank. Megan's jaw dropped in absolute shock. Her picture-perfect facade cracked instantly. She stepped forward, her voice rising an octave in sheer panic. She demanded the manager try the card again, screaming that the machine was obviously broken. The manager calmly swiped the card a second time. The result was identical. The bright red error message illuminated Megan's horrified face. She whipped around to face Corey. The sweet weeping bride from 5 minutes ago vanished completely. She shoved her manicured finger directly into his chest. She began aggressively berating him in front of the entire room. She demanded to know why the brilliant CEO of a medical technology company that just secured a $40 million federal contract could not afford a simple dinner bill. She loudly called him a broke failure, a complete embarrassment, and a pathetic excuse for a man. She shrieked that she had wasted 8 grueling months of her life preparing to elevate him into high society, only to find out he was as useless as his blue-collar father. Corey simply stood there, absorbing her vicious insults with his head bowed. He looked like a thoroughly defeated man. But from my isolated table by the swinging kitchen doors, I could see the slight, almost imperceptible upward curve of his lips. He briefly caught my eye across the chaotic room. We shared a silent, monumental communication. Only Corey and I knew the absolute truth about his financial status. At exactly 7 in the morning, while Megan was busy selecting her designer gown for the evening, Corey and I sat in a highly secure conference room with a team of elite wealth managers. We executed a flawless, irreversible legal maneuver. Every single dollar in Corey's personal bank accounts, every share of his rapidly growing tech startup, and every piece of intellectual property he possessed was legally transferred into a highly protected blind trust. The trust was structured so tight that it was completely impervious to any external claims. Corey had walked into the country club tonight with exactly $42 to his name. The prenuptial agreement Megan had so triumphantly forced him to sign gave her exactly 50% of a completely empty shell. The club manager finally reached his absolute limit. His professional patience evaporated entirely. He snapped his leather billfold shut with a loud crack. He informed Charles and Corey that he did not care about their banking errors or their family disputes. He announced that the Wellington Country Club did not tolerate the blatant theft of premium services. He loudly stated that they had consumed thousands of dollars in imported caviar and vintage champagne without the means to pay. He pulled a radio from his belt and threatened to call the local police department immediately. He declared he would have the entire Hastings family escorted out of the building in handcuffs and thrown onto the street like common criminals. The threat of public arrest shattered Charles's remaining composure. The illusion of his immense wealth was completely destroyed. The surrounding elite guests were now openly laughing and pulling out their expensive smartphones to record the humiliating spectacle. Charles lost his mind. He lunged forward with surprising speed. He grabbed Corey violently by the collar of his tuxedo jacket. He shook my son aggressively, spitting with pure rage. Charles screamed that Corey had ruined his daughter's pristine life. He demanded that Corey magically produce the funds to save them from this catastrophic public humiliation. He pulled his fist back, preparing to strike my son in the middle of the ballroom. That moment, I decided my role as the silent handyman was over. I placed my glass of cheap tap water firmly on the small table. The quiet click of the glass against the wood felt incredibly loud to me. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I straightened my vintage gray suit. I stepped away from the kitchen doors and walked directly into the center of the chaos. The silent adjustment had begun. The heavy oak doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung wide open with a resounding crash. Two uniformed police officers stepped into the opulent space, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. The club manager had not been making an empty threat. He had silently signaled the front desk to summon local authorities the moment Corey's debit card declined. The officers scanned the room, their eyes locking onto the chaotic scene unfolding at the center table. The manager stepped forward, his posture rigid with righteous indignation. He raised his hand and pointed directly at Charles Hastings. He loudly informed the officers that the Hastings family had intentionally consumed $30,000 worth of premium goods and services without the financial means or intention to pay. He formally requested their immediate arrest for grand theft of services. The sudden arrival of the law enforcement sent a violent shockwave through the crowd. The wealthy spectators gasped, stepping back to distance themselves from the impending criminal spectacle. Charles froze, his raised fist trembling in midair as the blood drained entirely from his face. The aggressive bravado that fueled him seconds prior evaporated into pure panic. He released Corey's collar and took a staggering step backward, raising his hands in surrender. Victoria let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, burying her face in her hands as the terrifying reality of public arrest set in. Megan stared at the approaching police officers with wide, terrified eyes. She looked at the flashing smartphones of her former friends, realizing her social reputation was disintegrating. Her survival instinct kicked in with ruthless efficiency. She turned her furious gaze toward Corey. She did not offer him a single word of support. She grabbed her left hand and violently yanked the diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly at Corey's chest. The diamond struck his lapel and bounced onto the marble floor. She screamed that she would never tie herself to a worthless fraud. She loudly declared the wedding was officially canceled and demanded the officers recognize she had no legal connection to this disastrous evening. I did not wait for the officers to reach the table. I moved with a deliberate, unhurried calmness that commanded the immediate attention of the room. I stepped directly between Charles Hastings and my son. I looked Charles dead in the eye, letting him see the quiet, dangerous authority I had suppressed all evening. I reached up and firmly pushed his trembling hand down to his side. He did not resist. He simply stared at me, thoroughly bewildered by the sudden shift in my demeanor. I turned my back to the Hastings family and faced the club manager and the two police officers. I told the manager there was no need for criminal charges tonight. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my faded 10-year-old gray vintage suit. My calloused fingers grasped the cold, heavy metal of my primary financial instrument. I pulled out a solid titanium black Centurion card. I did not hand it to him politely. I tossed it onto the silver platter that still held the worthless prenuptial agreement. The heavy metal card hit the silver tray with a loud, authoritative thud that silenced the remaining whispers in the ballroom. I instructed the manager to process the $30,000 balance immediately and to add a generous 20% gratuity for his highly efficient waitstaff. The manager looked down at the silver tray with profound irritation, clearly expecting another useless piece of plastic from a desperate family. He picked up the heavy metal card. His eyes scanned the engraved silver lettering across the matte black titanium surface. I watched the exact second his brain processed the name printed on the card. The irritated red flush of his cheeks vanished instantly, replaced by a sickly ghost-like pallor. His hands began to shake so violently that the card almost slipped from his grasp. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the metal card to my weathered face and back again. He recognized the name because it was printed on every single lease agreement his employer held. My anonymous holding company owned the 300 acres of prime commercial real estate the Wellington Country Club occupied. I was not just a wealthy patron, I was the absolute landlord of the very ground he was standing on. The manager bowed his head so low he nearly touched the table. He stammered a profound, trembling apology. He loudly and respectfully addressed me as Mr. Chairman. He begged for my forgiveness regarding the misunderstanding. He assured me the payment would be processed instantly. He signaled the police officers to stand down frantically, explaining the debt was fully secured by the most esteemed member of their institution. The words Mr. Chairman echoed through the silent ballroom like a thunderclap. The entire Hastings family froze in absolute shock. Charles stared at my worn suit, his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. Victoria lowered her hands from her face, her eyes wide with horrified realization. The man they had ruthlessly mocked, the man they had shoved next to the kitchen doors, the man they had relentlessly degraded as a common handyman was actually a titan of industry. The condescending speeches, the brutal insults, and the cruel isolation they had subjected me to suddenly crashed down upon them. They realized they had spent the entire evening viciously insulting the most powerful man in the room. Megan's attitude shifted with terrifying speed. The absolute panic of social ruin was instantly replaced by a desperate, ravenous greed. She looked at the black titanium card, then at Corey, and finally at me. She realized she had just violently discarded the heir to a monumental fortune. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold marble floor. Her silk gown pooled around her in an undignified heap. She frantically scoured the floor with her hands, desperately searching for the discarded diamond ring she had thrown at my son moments before. Her fingers finally brushed against the cold diamond. She snatched it from the floor and scrambled back to her feet. She clutched the ring tightly to her chest and squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a stream of massive tears down her face. She stepped toward me, her voice shaking with manufactured remorse. She sobbed that she had been overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of the police. She claimed her terrible words were just a product of extreme anxiety and panic. She ignored Corey and lunged forward with her arms wide open, attempting to wrap me in a tearful embrace to secure her position in our family. I maintained my strong posture and took one deliberate, measured step backward. Her arms closed around empty air. She stumbled forward slightly, her pathetic embrace meeting nothing but the cold, conditioned atmosphere of the grand ballroom. She stood right there, completely exposed, her hands grasping uselessly at the space I had just vacated. I looked down at her tear-stained face with absolute unyielding indifference. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and absolute as the crushing reality of her failed manipulation settled over her like a suffocating shroud. Victoria Hastings could not endure the deafening silence of the ballroom for another second. Her survival instincts mirrored her daughter's frantic greed. She forced a high-pitched musical laugh from her throat and stepped directly into the tense space between our families. She waved her hand dismissively through the air. She loudly declared that the entire evening had simply been ruined by too much stress, too much vintage wine, and the overwhelming emotions of wedding planning. She reached out and patted my shoulder, her touch feeling like ice against my suit. She tried to convince the staring guests that Megan was merely exhausted and prone to dramatic outbursts. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to rewrite the brutal reality everyone had just witnessed. Megan instantly caught her mother's cue. She stayed on her knees, clutching the discarded diamond ring tightly against her chest. She turned her tear-streaked face upward to look at Corey. Her voice trembled with a perfectly engineered vulnerability. She begged him to forgive her temporary lapse in judgment. She pleaded with him to slide the ring back onto her finger so they could move past this silly misunderstanding. Then she turned her desperate gaze toward me. She possessed the sheer audacity to call me Dad. She cried that she had always wanted a strong father figure in her life and claimed she was profoundly relieved to discover I was a man of such magnificent stature and capability. The blinding hypocrisy of her words made my stomach turn. I looked at Corey. He stared down at the woman he had almost married with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not extend his hand to help her up. He simply crossed his arms over his tuxedo jacket and waited for my lead. I looked at Victoria and her fake smile. I decided I was not going to walk out the door and let them spin this narrative to their advantage. I told Victoria I completely agreed that we should sit down and discuss our new family dynamic like civilized adults. I did not return to the small, pathetic table by the kitchen doors. I walked deliberately toward the beautifully decorated head table in the center of the room. I pulled back the mahogany chair previously occupied by Charles Hastings. I sat down in the middle of their pristine arrangement. The physical shift in power was absolute and undeniable. The remaining guests stopped whispering and leaned forward, captivated by the sudden reversal of fortune. I gestured toward the empty chairs around me. I calmly invited Charles, Victoria, and Megan to join me at the head table. They scrambled to comply. Megan sprinted to the table, wiping her tears and attempting to look composed. Charles slumped into a chair, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Victoria sat rigidly next to him, clutching her silk napkin like a life preserver. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the crystal pitcher. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch out, forcing Charles to stew in his own escalating panic. I turned my attention entirely to Charles. I raised my voice, ensuring my words carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. I told Charles that since we were merging our powerful families, I wanted to understand the intricate details of his legendary import-export empire. Charles forced a stiff, arrogant smile. He puffed out his chest, attempting to regain a fraction of his lost pride in front of his wealthy peers. He began to speak in broad, sweeping corporate buzzwords about global supply chains and massive profit margins. I did not let him finish his rehearsed speech. I cut him off sharply. I asked him directly about his primary shipping route through the port of Long Beach. I inquired why his massive cargo freighters had not docked there in over 14 months. I then asked him about his 300,000 square foot distribution warehouse located just outside of Dallas. I asked him why the electricity had been shut off at that location for non-payment since last November. Charles stopped speaking instantly. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at me as if I had just read his darkest diary entries aloud to the entire world. He stammered frantically, trying to construct a coherent lie about restructuring assets and changing global market conditions. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the past 3 weeks meticulously destroying his false reality. Weeks ago, when Corey first showed me the cruel text messages on Megan's phone, I deployed my elite team of forensic accountants. They pulled every single public financial filing associated with the Hastings family name. They dug through the shell companies and offshore accounts. They discovered that Charles was not a titan of industry. His company had been completely bankrupt in all but name for over 2 years. He had been shuffling debt from one predatory lender to another, barely keeping his head above water. He was desperately banking on Corey's tech money to save him from absolute financial ruin. Now I was exposing his colossal failure to the very people he had spent years trying to impress. The elite guests in the ballroom began whispering again this time, pointing directly at the sweating, defeated man at the head table. Charles realized his business reputation was completely shattered. He needed to defend his wealth immediately to salvage whatever fragments of high society status he had left. He slammed his hand on the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass. He loudly declared that his business ventures were merely a hobby. He practically screamed that his true wealth was tied up in premium residential real estate. He boasted about his massive hillside mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. He loudly informed the entire room that the property was worth $15 million and carried zero debt. He claimed his immense home equity alone made him wealthier than anyone else in the building, and he would not sit here and be interrogated by a man who dressed like a retired factory worker. He puffed out his chest, glaring at me with a desperate, wild defiance. I listened to his arrogant boasting with a profound sense of satisfaction. I looked at Corey, who offered a slow, knowing smile. I turned back to Charles and allowed a dangerous smile to spread across my face. I told Charles that real estate was indeed a fascinating and highly volatile market. I raised my right hand into the air, keeping my eyes locked on his sweating face. I snapped my fingers once. The head waiter, who had been watching me closely for instructions, immediately nodded. He turned and gestured sharply toward the back of the room. The massive, heavy oak doors of the main ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. A tall man stepped through the threshold. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and carried a heavy distressed leather briefcase under his arm. It was my personal attorney, Mr. Mitchell. He walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with the absolute confidence of an executioner arriving to carry out a final sentence. Mr. Mitchell did not pause to acknowledge the whispers of the guests. He moved with a terrifying precision, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He bypassed the terrified club manager and stopped directly behind Charles Hastings. The wealthy import-export king tried to swivel in his mahogany chair to demand an explanation for this unprecedented intrusion. Mitchell did not give him the chance to speak a single word. He unlatched his distressed leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on stark white paper. He reached over Charles's shoulder and dropped the formidable stack directly onto his pristine porcelain dinner plate. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the fine china echoed across the silent head table. Charles stared at the top sheet, his eyes struggling to focus on the bold black lettering under the glaring chandelier light. It was a formal, uncompromising notice of immediate foreclosure and total asset seizure. The documents meticulously detailed the catastrophic default on the Hastings family hillside mansion, the heavily overdue leases on their entire fleet of luxury vehicles, and the completely delinquent status of 3 massive commercial business loans. Charles let out a guttural sound that was half arrogant laugh and half gasp of pure panic. He grabbed the thick stack of papers with shaking hands and aggressively ripped the top pages in half. He grabbed his silk napkin and wiped the sudden sheen of sweat from his forehead before turning his wrath back toward the lawyer standing over him. His voice cracked with desperation as he tried to maintain his authoritative facade in front of the silent judging crowd. He threw the torn pieces onto the floor, shouting that this was a ridiculous and highly illegal mistake. He loudly declared that his primary bank had just granted him a mandatory 6-month extension on all of his outstanding credit lines due to his esteemed status as a top-tier client. He pointed a trembling finger at Mitchell, threatening to sue him for criminal harassment and public defamation. He demanded that the club security drag this supposed lawyer out into the street immediately. Mitchell did not flinch at the aggressive outburst. He crossed his arms and stared down at the pathetic display. The Hastings family had built their entire reputation on smoke and mirrors, and Mitchell was here to smash the glass. He smoothly adjusted his navy blue suit jacket and looked down at Charles with absolute professional apathy. He spoke with a clear, carrying voice that ensured every single person in the ballroom heard the brutal truth. Mitchell explained that the original bank had indeed considered an extension, but ultimately classified the Hastings portfolio as highly toxic, unrecoverable debt. Therefore, the bank exercised its legal right to quietly sell off the entirety of the delinquent accounts to a private institutional investor at a steep discount to instantly clear their ledgers. Charles stopped shouting. The remaining color drained from his face as the terrifying reality of sold debt washed over him. He frantically demanded to know the identity of the predatory vulture fund that had purchased his life. I leaned forward in my chair, resting my calloused hands flat on the mahogany table. I looked directly into Charles's wide, terrified eyes and offered him a deeply unforgiving smile. I told him he did not need to search for a faceless corporate entity. I announced with absolute unyielding clarity that my private holding company had purchased every single penny of his toxic debt. I bought it all with pure liquid cash. I informed Charles Hastings that I was now his sole uncompromising creditor, and I had absolutely zero intention of honoring any previous extensions. I held the deed to his mansion, the titles to his cars, and the remaining collateral of his hollow business empire in the palm of my hand. Victoria let out a high-pitched gasp, pressing her manicured hands against her mouth. Megan stared at Corey, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization of how thoroughly she had been outplayed. Corey met her gaze with a completely cold, calculating stare. He had known about her vile intentions for exactly 32 days. A month ago, Corey had accidentally picked up Megan's unlocked phone from their kitchen counter to check the time. A text message from Charles had illuminated the screen. The message explicitly instructed Megan to accelerate the wedding date before Corey's board of directors could implement a mandatory financial vesting period on his new federal medical contract. Charles had called Corey a naive cash cow that needed to be slaughtered quickly. That single cruel text message shattered the illusion of their entire relationship. Corey immediately brought the devastating evidence to me. We did not confront her with screaming or dramatic ultimatums. We chose a much more permanent, devastating route. Over the last 4 weeks, while Megan was busy tasting wedding cakes and mocking my vintage clothes, Corey and I systematically weaponized my capital. My forensic accountants relentlessly tracked down every single financial vulnerability the Hastings family possessed. We moved massive amounts of liquid cash through anonymous proxy buyers to aggressively purchase their corporate and personal debts. We built a flawless legal cage around them, ensuring they could never escape the consequences of their predatory greed. We funded their extravagant engagement dinner tonight, knowing perfectly well it would be the exact stage where we would execute their complete financial execution. Every slight, every insult, and every condescending remark they hurled at me this evening only cemented their inevitable downfall. Charles Hastings sat frozen in his chair, his mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of his absolute ruin. He looked at the torn foreclosure documents scattered on the marble floor. He looked at his weeping wife and his horrified daughter, who now realized her luxury lifestyle was entirely obliterated. Finally, he looked at me, the retired blue-collar worker sitting at the head of the table holding the literal keys to his entire existence. The crushing humiliation fractured his remaining sanity. A primal, reckless fury overtook him, completely overriding his refined, high-society persona. Charles let out a deafening, animalistic roar that shocked the surrounding guests. He abruptly kicked his heavy mahogany chair backward so violently that it crashed onto the floor, splintering the wood. He charged directly at me, raising his right fist, fully intending to strike my face and inflict physical damage to reclaim a fraction of his lost pride. He never even came close to reaching me. Corey reacted with lightning speed, moving with a fierce protective instinct. He stepped out from behind the table and intercepted the older man's violent path. Corey grabbed Charles by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, using the man's own aggressive momentum against him. Corey shoved Charles backward with a powerful, unforgiving thrust. Charles stumbled wildly across the polished marble floor, his arms flailing as he desperately tried to catch his balance. He careened out of control and crashed backward into a tall, decorative catering table positioned near the edge of the dance floor. The table was stacked high with hundreds of delicate crystal champagne glasses arranged in a massive, shimmering pyramid. The impact was spectacular and devastating. The table collapsed instantly under Charles's flailing weight. The crystal pyramid shattered with a deafening crash, sending thousands of razor-sharp shards of glass exploding across the room in a glittering, dangerous wave. Champagne rained down over Charles as he lay groaning in the wreckage of his own shattered dignity, completely surrounded by the broken pieces of his fake empire. Megan snapped out of her greedy trance. She spun away from me and lunged toward Corey, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She screamed at the top of her lungs, accusing my son of viciously assaulting her father. She shrieked that Corey was a violent, unpredictable monster who belonged in a maximum security prison cell. She turned to the two uniformed police officers who were still standing near the entrance and demanded they immediately arrest him for aggravated battery. The officers did not move an inch. They looked at the club manager, who subtly shook his head. They had watched Charles initiate the physical altercation. They recognized justifiable self-defense when they saw it. Megan realized the authorities were not going to intervene on her behalf. She pivoted her strategy instantly. She marched back to the center table, her high heels crunching loudly over the broken glass. She snatched the dark leather portfolio from the silver platter. She held the signed prenuptial agreement high in the air like a shield of invincible armor. Megan projected her voice across the room, ensuring every single person heard her desperate declaration of victory. She stated that physical violence would not change the concrete legal reality of their situation. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Corey and reminded him that his signature was already drying on the binding contract. She loudly announced that as of this very evening, she was the legal owner of 50% of his groundbreaking medical technology startup. She glared at me, her blue eyes burning with a venomous, triumphant fire. She declared that it did not matter if I held the deeds to their hillside mansion or the titles to their luxury cars. She proudly proclaimed that she would immediately force a corporate liquidation of Corey's personal and professional assets. She explicitly planned to sell her newly acquired half of the $40 million federal contract to the highest corporate bidder available on the open market. She bragged that the massive financial proceeds would be more than enough to completely pay off my predatory debt, buy back her family's absolute financial freedom, and leave her independently wealthy for the rest of her natural life. She clutched the leather portfolio tightly to her chest, breathing heavily. She was entirely convinced she had just outsmarted the most powerful man in the room and saved her family from imminent total ruin. Corey looked at her. He did not look angry. He did not look betrayed. He simply threw his head back and laughed aloud. It was not a bitter, cynical chuckle. It was a loud, booming, genuine laugh that cut straight through the suffocating tension of the ballroom. The joyous sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, completely shattering Megan's momentary illusion of absolute dominance. Her triumphant smile faltered, quickly replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. Her hands tightened aggressively around the leather folder. She demanded to know exactly what was so funny. She screamed that liquidating a multi-million-dollar medical technology firm was absolutely not a laughing matter. Corey slowly shook his head, wiping a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of his eye. He looked at Megan with a profound sense of pity. He told her she was absolutely right about the contract being completely legally binding. He agreed that she was now officially entitled to exactly 50% of his corporate equity. Then he turned toward the tall man in the navy blue suit standing near the ruined catering table. Corey respectfully invited Lawyer Mitchell to step forward and explain the exact legal corporate structure of the medical tech startup to his former fiancée and the entire captive audience. Lawyer Mitchell adjusted his heavy leather briefcase and stepped directly into the center of the room. He spoke with the clear, measured cadence of a man who dealt exclusively in undeniable hard facts. He addressed Megan directly, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. He explained that she had fundamentally misunderstood the ownership hierarchy of the technology firm from the very beginning. Mitchell stated with absolute clarity that Corey had never owned a single share of the startup. A collective gasp rippled through the remaining elite guests who were hanging on his every word. Megan lowered the leather portfolio slightly, her eyes darting frantically back and forth between Corey and the stoic lawyer. Mitchell calmly revealed the ultimate truth we had kept buried securely for 5 long years. He explained that when Corey first developed the groundbreaking surgical software, he required massive amounts of seed capital to build the technical infrastructure and hire elite programmers. I had personally provided that initial funding through one of my anonymous commercial holding firms. Mitchell clarified that on paper, I was the sole legal owner, the primary shareholder, and the acting chief executive officer of the entire global operation. Corey was the visionary, the lead software developer, and the public face of the highly successful brand, but legally, he was classified merely as a highly compensated salaried employee. He received a standard tax form at the end of every fiscal year, just like everyone else working under my corporate umbrella. Mitchell pointed a long, steady finger at the leather portfolio clutched in Megan's shaking hands. He delivered the final crushing blow with absolute professional apathy. He informed her that the extreme prenuptial agreement she had so aggressively forced Corey to sign was indeed flawlessly executed. It entitled her to exactly 50% of Corey's corporate equity. However, since Corey possessed 0 equity, 0 shares, and 0 ownership rights, her 50% stake was mathematically and legally worthless. Mitchell explicitly confirmed that the prenuptial agreement gave Megan exactly 50% of absolutely nothing. The brutal revelation hit Megan with the force of a physical strike. The remaining color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. The heavy leather portfolio slipped from her weakened grasp and hit the marble floor with a dull, hollow thud. Her entire 8-month manipulation, the fake affection, the orchestrated arguments, and the relentless isolation tactics had all been a monumental waste of her time. She looked at her father, who was still groaning amidst the broken glass on the floor, and her mother, who was silently weeping at the head table. Her entire family was completely bankrupt, and her golden parachute had just vanished into thin air. She was totally cornered. The luxurious, effortless life she felt she was fundamentally owed was gone forever. The desperate reality of her situation activated a dark primal survival mechanism deep within her. She locked her terrified eyes with Corey. Her facial expression rapidly morphed from devastated shock into a mask of pure, calculated tragedy. She took a very deep, trembling breath, preparing to play her ultimate emotional card. Megan's realization that the company was a ghost ship shifted her survival instincts into overdrive. The luxurious life she felt she was owed was dissolving into ash right before her eyes. She needed an anchor, an unbreakable tether to my family's wealth to save herself from impending poverty. She let out a sharp, agonizing wail that pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor, deliberately letting her extravagant silk wedding gown pool around her like a tragic fallen heroine. She wrapped both of her manicured arms tightly around her lower abdomen. She curled inward, her face contorted in a flawless, theatrical mask of physical agony. She screamed that the unimaginable stress of this brutal, coordinated ambush was actively endangering her unborn baby. The wealthy guests who had been moving toward the exits suddenly froze. Megan rocked back and forth on the hard floor, ensuring every single person witnessed her manufactured torment. She looked up at Corey through a curtain of strategically placed tears. She projected her trembling voice across the vast room, commanding the attention of every remaining spectator. She declared that she was exactly 3 months pregnant with his child. She sobbed loudly about the absolute cruelty of a father publicly humiliating the mother of his firstborn heir. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me, accusing me of trying to starve my own flesh and blood. She demanded immediate and permanent financial support for the child. She shrieked that even if the startup equity was legally worthless, she had a permanent, undeniable legal right to my wealth through the bloodline of the baby she carried. She insisted that Corey had a moral and legal obligation to provide a massive, irrevocable trust fund immediately to secure the heir's future. Her performance was a terrifying masterclass in emotional manipulation, shamelessly weaponizing the concept of an innocent child to extort a fortune from us. Victoria Hastings instantly recognized the brilliant lifeline her daughter had just thrown them. She snapped out of her paralyzed shock at the head table. She rushed across the shattered glass of the dance floor, ignoring the danger, and dropped to her knees beside her weeping daughter. Victoria wrapped her arms protectively around Megan, glaring up at us with venomous, righteous indignation. She aggressively ordered the club manager to call for an ambulance, immediately claiming her highly sensitive daughter was going into premature distress due to our calculated psychological torture. The manager simply stood there looking directly to me for instruction. I offered him a slight dismissive shake of my head, and he remained perfectly still, refusing to aid their theatrical display. Victoria turned her vicious, calculating gaze toward Corey. She completely abandoned all pretense of high society elegance and grace. She screamed that he was a heartless, sadistic monster who was actively endangering the future of the Hastings bloodline. She demanded a massive upfront financial settlement to cover the severe emotional distress and the imminent specialized medical bills. She claimed that keeping the fragile baby safe from this highly toxic environment would require millions of dollars in immediate liquid compensation. She loudly threatened to take this horrifying story to every major news outlet and social publication in the city, promising to completely ruin my corporate reputation by exposing exactly how I treated my pregnant daughter-in-law. She demanded I hand over the clean deed to their hillside mansion right now as a preliminary gesture of goodwill for the unborn child. The remaining elite guests murmured among themselves, clearly swayed by the sudden introduction of an innocent baby into this brutal corporate execution. The social pressure was entirely designed to corner us, forcing a rapid, incredibly expensive surrender to silence the scandal. Corey did not flinch. He did not step forward to check on the weeping woman carrying his supposed child. He stood tall, looking down at the two desperate women on the floor with an expression of absolute freezing detachment. The chaotic, frantic energy of Victoria's aggressive screams and Megan's theatrical sobs battered against his total, unyielding silence. The contrast between their hysteria and his composure was incredibly striking. The entire grand ballroom slowly fell completely silent once again, waiting with bated breath for the young man to crack under the immense crushing pressure of impending fatherhood. Corey simply reached a steady, deliberate hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He did not pull out a checkbook to surrender. He did not pull out his phone to call his lawyers and negotiate a desperate settlement. He slowly withdrew a crisp, white, heavily sealed envelope. The thick parchment paper bore the unmistakable, deeply embossed blue logo of the Johns Hopkins Medical Institute. The highly official nature of the document immediately commanded the room's undivided attention. Corey held the envelope by the corner, his cold eyes locked entirely on Megan's tear-stained face. The frantic, performative sobbing abruptly stopped. Megan stared intently at the renowned medical emblem, a sudden flicker of genuine, terrifying uncertainty crossing her flawless features. Victoria paused her aggressive, loud demands, her eyes darting nervously to the sealed envelope in Corey's hand. The air in the opulent room grew suffocatingly dense with anticipation. Corey finally spoke with a voice completely devoid of any warmth or emotion. His words were sharp, precise, and entirely unforgiving. He addressed the entire room, making absolutely sure every single guest heard the undeniable truth. He stated that in his early 20s, long before he ever met Megan or built the revolutionary medical software, he had fought a brutal, agonizing battle against a highly aggressive form of cancer. He detailed the grueling, terrible months he spent confined inside the oncology wards at Johns Hopkins. He described the relentless rounds of heavy radiation and the exceptionally aggressive chemotherapy treatments that had utterly ravaged his body in a desperate bid to eradicate the spreading disease. He told the silent audience that the brilliant doctors had successfully saved his life, but the victory had come with a severe, permanent, and irreversible physical cost. The extreme chemical treatments had completely and permanently destroyed his reproductive system. Corey looked directly down into Megan's wide, terrified blue eyes. He announced with absolute, undeniable medical certainty that he was entirely sterile. He could never father a biological child naturally. He stated that multiple top-tier specialists had confirmed this absolute biological fact year after grueling year. He told Megan he had kept this deeply personal, painful medical history a complete secret from her for the past 8 months. He explained that as her lies grew bolder, as her financial demands increased, and as her isolation tactics became vastly more aggressive, he needed to know exactly how far her profound deception would truly go. He had waited patiently in the shadows to see what ultimate destructive weapon she would try to use when she finally realized she was permanently cornered. Now she had played her final desperate card, and it was a complete biological impossibility. Corey stepped forward and casually dropped the sealed medical file. The pristine white envelope fluttered down through the tense air and landed squarely in Megan's lap. The heavy silence in the ballroom was absolute and unbreakable. The definitive, undeniable proof of her ultimate lie rested right on top of the extravagant, wildly expensive silk wedding dress she had bought with our money. Megan stared down at the Johns Hopkins logo as if it were a venomous snake. Her skin turned a stark, sickly shade of ghost white. The entire foundation of her fabricated existence shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her mother, Victoria, slowly backed away from her daughter on her hands and knees, her face registering a profound, horrified realization of the trap they had walked into. The manipulation was completely dead. Corey leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deeply demanding register that chilled the room. He asked her the only remaining question that mattered now. He demanded to know exactly whose child she was actually carrying. The words hung in the quiet air like a physical, looming threat. Megan did not look up at Corey. She did not look at her utterly humiliated parents. Instead, her head snapped up violently. Her terrified, darting eyes scanned the crowd of remaining wealthy guests. She looked frantically past the shattered champagne pyramid and the ruined dining tables. Her desperate, panic-stricken gaze locked instantly onto a specific young male guest standing entirely frozen near the grand mahogany entrance at the back of the room. Megan tore her eyes away from the grand mahogany entrance as if the very act of looking had physically burned her. She whipped her head back toward Corey, her chest heaving as she scrambled desperately to rebuild her shattered illusions. She adamantly refused to name the father of her child. She began to stammer, her voice losing all its previous theatrical power, reducing to a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She clutched the Johns Hopkins medical envelope in her trembling hands and frantically declared that the renowned clinic must have made a catastrophic clerical error. She insisted that medical mix-ups happen all the time and begged Corey to believe that the baby was a biological miracle meant only for them. She crawled across the cold marble floor, ignoring the sharp shards of broken crystal from her father's ruined champagne pyramid, and tried to grab Corey's tailored trousers. Corey smoothly sidestepped her desperate grasp. He did not offer a single ounce of compassion. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers, gesturing toward the tall man in the navy blue suit standing near the edge of the ruined dance floor. Lawyer Mitchell did not hesitate. He stepped forward with absolute mechanical precision, pulling a sleek silver tablet from his heavy leather briefcase. He walked directly to the country club's master audiovisual control panel mounted on the nearby wall. He connected a small cable to the terminal. A sudden mechanical hum echoed through the silent, tense ballroom. The massive high-definition projector screen, typically reserved for displaying romantic slideshows of the bride and groom, slowly descended from the vaulted ceiling directly behind the head table. The opulent chandeliers automatically dimmed, casting the sprawling room into a stark, cinematic twilight. The whispering crowd of high society elites fell completely silent, their eyes locked onto the glowing white canvas. Mitchell tapped the glass screen of his tablet once. The massive projector illuminated the dark room with crystal-clear, undeniable security footage. The high-definition video displayed the luxurious, dimly lit hallway of a five-star downtown hotel. The digital timestamp in the bottom corner indicated the footage was captured exactly 3 weeks ago, right in the middle of Megan's supposed wedding planning crunch. The heavy wooden door of a premium penthouse suite filled the center of the frame. Seconds later, Megan appeared on the screen. She was wearing the exact same designer cocktail dress she had flaunted at a family dinner we attended the following night. She was not alone. A tall, sharply dressed man with slicked back hair pinned her against the expensive wallpaper. He kissed her deeply, aggressively, and with profound familiarity. Megan enthusiastically returned the affection, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck before pulling him by the lapels into the dark hotel room and kicking the heavy door shut behind them. The collective gasp from the wedding guests was deafening. The man in the video was not a stranger to anyone in that ballroom. He was Charles Hastings's primary business investor and the so-called savior of his failing import-export empire. Corey had uncovered the entire sickening truth weeks ago when my forensic accountants cracked Charles's heavily encrypted financial ledgers. Charles was not just bankrupt. He had been actively embezzling massive amounts of capital from his own corporate clients for over 3 years to fund Victoria's extravagant lifestyle. The slick investor in the video had discovered the massive fraud. Instead of reporting Charles to the federal authorities and sending him to a maximum security prison, the investor offered a vile, highly illegal compromise. He promised to quietly absorb the missing funds and permanently bury the embezzlement evidence, but only under one absolute condition. Charles had to guarantee that Megan would successfully secure Corey's highly lucrative tech money. The entire Hastings family was completely complicit. Charles and Victoria had essentially sold their own daughter to a corrupt corporate predator, using her as a human shield to avoid federal prison while simultaneously pushing her to extract millions from my son to pay off the ransom. The sheer depravity of the arrangement hung heavy in the dimly lit ballroom. Megan remained frozen on her knees, staring up at the massive screen displaying her ultimate betrayal. Her mother, Victoria, let out a wretched, choking sob, covering her face with her hands, as the unforgiving light of the projector exposed her family as remorseless criminals. Charles sat utterly paralyzed in his splintered chair, his face entirely drained of blood. He knew the exposure of this video meant his secret immunity deal was completely dead. The investor would no longer protect him. Federal prison was no longer a distant possibility. It was an absolute, impending certainty. The tension in the room suddenly snapped. A sharp, violent sound echoed from the back of the ballroom near the grand mahogany entrance. The slick investor from the video was actually standing right there in the audience tonight. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo, attempting to shrink into the shadows of the doorway to escape the burning gaze of 100 judgmental peers. He did not succeed. The woman standing directly beside him was his legal wife of 15 years. She possessed a formidable reputation in the city's financial sector and held the vast majority of their combined wealth in her own name. She stared at the frozen image of her husband kissing Megan on the massive projector screen. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply turned toward her husband with terrifying, calculated precision. She raised her hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across his face. The sound of the impact rivaled the crash of the champagne pyramid. The investor stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly swelling cheek, his eyes wide with fear. His wife stepped into the light, radiating absolute fury. She did not care about the surrounding crowd. She spoke with a loud, ringing authority that commanded the entire ballroom. She declared that she would not spend another second tethered to a pathetic cheating fraud. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone. She loudly announced to her husband and the entire captivated audience that she was calling her elite legal team right this very second. She promised to instantly freeze every single one of their joint bank accounts aggressively, lock down their shared investment portfolios, and forcefully seize control of the corporate holding firm he used to manage Charles Hastings' debt. Charles let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He slumped forward over the mahogany table, burying his head in his arms. The absolute finality of the woman's declaration severed his last remaining lifeline to the outside world. The corrupt investor who was supposed to shield Charles from the federal authorities and secure Megan's future was now completely financially castrated by his own wife. The leverage Charles desperately relied upon evaporated into thin air. He had absolutely nothing left. No mansion, no cars, no business, no secret immunity deal, and absolutely zero social standing. Corey stood over Megan, who was still trembling on the marble floor. He spent 4 long weeks meticulously preparing for this exact moment. He smiled coldly, knowing that it was completely over now. The slap resonated in the grand ballroom as the investor staggered backward, clutching his swelling cheek. His wife did not spare him another glance. She marched out the mahogany doors with the posture of a conquering general. The investor stood frozen before scrambling blindly after her. He practically ran out of the Wellington Country Club, leaving behind Charles's final desperate lifeline. Charles remained slumped over the ruined head table. He watched the mahogany doors swing shut, sealing his financial and social doom. He listened to the murmurs of the elite guests he had spent his entire life trying to impress. They looked at him with naked disgust. The suffocating reality closed in around his throat. He had no money, no leverage, and no protector. The primal instinct for self-preservation completely overrode any remaining shred of loyalty Charles possessed. He slowly lifted his head from his arms. He did not look down at his daughter Megan, who was trembling on the cold marble floor surrounded by shattered crystal. He did not comfort his wife Victoria, who was openly sobbing beside him, her face buried in her hands. Charles simply stood up. He kept his head lowered, attempting to physically shrink himself to avoid the burning gaze of the crowd. He took a calculated step backward, moving away from the bright center of the ballroom. He plotted a silent trajectory toward the dimly lit service exit just beyond the swinging kitchen doors. He intended to slip out through the back alley, abandon his family to face the devastating fallout of his monumental fraud, and vanish into the night before the federal authorities could finalize his destruction. I watched his pathetic retreat with absolute clarity. I had anticipated this exact cowardly maneuver from the very beginning. A man who would willingly sell his own daughter to a corrupt corporate predator to save his own skin would never stay to face the consequences of his actions. I remained perfectly still for a long moment, allowing him to falsely believe his escape had gone unnoticed by the distracted audience in the ballroom. I let him take 3 more stealthy steps toward the shadows of the kitchen hallway. Then I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a gunshot. The 2 uniformed police officers had remained stationed near the entrance of the ballroom since the club manager initially summoned them for the unpaid $30,000 dinner bill. Upon hearing my distinct cue, they moved with immediate, synchronized precision. They marched briskly across the polished floor, their heavy boots announcing their undeniable authority. They bypassed the stunned guests and moved directly to the back of the room, positioning themselves squarely in front of the swinging kitchen doors. Charles took one final desperate step toward his intended escape route, only to find his path completely blocked by a solid wall of dark blue uniforms and gleaming silver badges. He stopped dead in his tracks, his shoulders slumped forward. The last remaining ounce of fight evaporated from his body. He was entirely trapped. I stood up from my chair at the head table. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and retrieved a thick, heavy manila folder. I walked calmly across the room, my footsteps steady and measured. I approached the 2 police officers and handed the dense file directly to the senior patrolman. I instructed him to review the contents immediately. The officer opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first few pages of stark, heavily tabulated financial data. His professional demeanor instantly shifted into a state of heightened, serious alert. I turned to face Charles, making sure my voice carried effortlessly to every corner of the silent ballroom. I explained that my elite team of forensic accountants had not merely stopped at uncovering his hollow import-export business or the toxic loans he used to fund his fraudulent lifestyle. While aggressively buying up his outstanding debt over the past 4 weeks, my team had systematically traced the exact origins of his remaining cash flow. We needed to know exactly how a bankrupt man was still paying for his country club memberships and vintage champagne. The financial trail led us directly into the heart of his corporate accounting department. I revealed the ultimate devastating truth to the captivated audience. Charles had not just been defrauding his wealthy investors. He had been actively and maliciously stealing from his own working-class employees. For the past 3 years, he had been systematically siphoning thousands of dollars directly from their dedicated pension funds. He had routed their hard-earned retirement savings through a complex labyrinth of shell companies, ultimately funneling the stolen cash into heavily guarded offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He had literally stolen the future security of the men and women who worked in his warehouses just to maintain the absolute illusion of his own opulence. The collective revulsion in the ballroom was palpable. The wealthy guests who had previously tolerated Charles's arrogance now stared at him with pure, unadulterated contempt. Stealing from elite investors was considered a harsh reality of doing business, but stealing the retirement funds of ordinary laborers was a universally unforgivable transgression. The senior police officer finished scanning the executive summary provided by my legal team. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He stepped forward and grabbed Charles roughly by the arm. The officer read the federal embezzlement charges aloud, his voice echoing with absolute damning authority. He explicitly detailed the massive scale of the wire fraud, the severe pension theft, and the gross violation of federal labor laws. Charles felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap tightly around his wrists. The terrifying click signaled the absolute end of his life as a free man. The officer informed him that given the sheer magnitude of the stolen pension funds and his documented attempts to flee the jurisdiction, he was facing a minimum of 3 decades in a federal penitentiary. The crushing weight of 30 years behind bars finally broke Charles completely. The man who had spent his entire life projecting power and control instantly reverted to a terrified, cornered animal. He looked desperately around the room, searching for anyone to absorb the blame. His frantic eyes locked onto his weeping wife. Victoria was staring at him in sheer horror, her makeup smeared across her face. Charles did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his handcuffed wrists and pointed a shaking finger directly at her. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with pure panic. He loudly declared that he was completely innocent. He shrieked that Victoria was the true mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. He told the police officers in the staring crowd that she had aggressively demanded the stolen pension money to fund her designer wardrobe, her exorbitant hillside mansion, and her relentless, insatiable greed. He violently threw his wife of 30 years to the wolves, frantically begging the officers to arrest her instead, completely destroying the last remaining fragment of his fractured family in a pathetic, useless attempt to save himself. Victoria's face contorted into venom. The woman who spent 30 years cultivating flawless aristocratic grace shattered under her husband's betrayal. She launched herself forward and violently tackled Charles. Her manicured fingernails became weapons, clawing ruthlessly at his face and tearing his champagne-soaked tuxedo. She screamed he was a pathetic coward who ruined her life. She struck him repeatedly, her diamond bracelets catching the harsh chandelier light. Charles, restricted by heavy steel handcuffs, could only twist away and shield his bleeding face. He shouted for the police to pull his deranged wife off him. The pristine Hastings family degenerated into a vicious brawl. The high society guests watched in horrified fascination. The illusion of wealth they wielded against the working class was replaced by a grotesque display of mutual destruction. The two police officers rushed forward, struggling to pull the screaming woman off her husband. While the police officers subdued her unhinged parents, Megan saw a narrow window of opportunity. She dropped to her hands and knees. Her expensive silk wedding gown dragged across the marble floor, accumulating dirt and broken crystal as she crawled frantically away from the center table. She scuttled toward the grand mahogany doors at the front of the ballroom, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She believed if she could slip out the front entrance, she could escape the devastating legal ruin consuming her family. She pushed herself up, taking one hurried step toward freedom. Corey stepped smoothly out of the shadows and planted himself in front of the heavy wooden doors. He crossed his arms, blocking her only path of escape. Megan stopped dead in her tracks, looking up at the man she had spent 8 months manipulating. The fake tears vanished. She glared at him with the raw hatred of a cornered predator. Corey did not raise his voice. He simply uncrossed his arms, took one step closer, and calmly extended his open right hand. He looked directly into her furious blue eyes and issued a single, unwavering demand. He told her to return the diamond necklace she was wearing. Megan instinctively reached up and clamped her hands tightly over the heavy, glittering stones resting against her collarbone. The necklace was an absolute masterpiece of vintage craftsmanship, featuring dozens of flawless diamonds set in intricate platinum webbing. She clutched the jewelry as if it were a physical life preserver, her knuckles turning white. She shrieked that she would never give it back. Corey did not retract his outstretched hand. His eyes remained incredibly cold. He told her she did not understand the profound significance of the jewelry she was clinging to. Corey explained to the silent crowd that the necklace was not a random purchase. It did not belong to him. The vintage diamonds belonged entirely to my late wife Corey's mother. The exquisite piece was the only physical heirloom my wife inherited from her grandmother, a woman who worked tirelessly in textile factories her entire life just to secure her family's future. My wife wore that exact necklace on our wedding day, standing beside me when I had nothing but calloused hands. It represented a legacy of profound loyalty, absolute sacrifice, and genuine love. It was the physical embodiment of everything the Hastings family despised. Corey took another step toward Megan. He explained he had allowed her to wear his mother's priceless heirloom tonight. He knew exactly what she was planning to do with the prenuptial agreement. Corey told Megan he wanted her to wear the necklace so he could publicly strip it from her neck in front of the entire city. He wanted her to feel the crushing weight of holding a legacy she was unworthy of inheriting. He stated that a woman who would fake a pregnancy to steal a corporate empire did not possess the fundamental human decency required to wear his mother's diamonds. He commanded her to unhook the platinum clasp immediately. Megan took a stubborn step backward, pressing her spine against the heavy mahogany doors. She screamed that the vintage diamonds were a formal engagement gift and therefore belonged exclusively to her under the law. She declared Corey freely gave her the jewelry to secure her hand in marriage, making it her personal property regardless of the canceled wedding. She told Corey she planned to march out the front doors, drive directly to a premium pawnbroker in the morning, and melt the platinum down to fund her fresh start. She aggressively refused to unhook the clasp, daring Corey to forcefully rip it from her neck in front of the watching police officers. Lawyer Mitchell stepped out from behind the ruined catering table and walked briskly across the marble floor. He stopped directly beside Corey, clutching his heavy leather briefcase. Mitchell did not engage with Megan's hysterical screaming. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a single neatly folded document. He held the crisp white paper up, ensuring Megan could clearly read the highly official legal seal stamped at the top. Mitchell spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that easily overpowered her frantic shouting. He informed her that her legal assessment of the jewelry was entirely incorrect. Mitchell explained that Corey never officially gifted her the vintage diamonds. The necklace had been meticulously cataloged and legally registered by my private holding company earlier that week. The document Mitchell held was a formal notarized inventory ledger. Mitchell stated clearly that the diamonds were legally classified as loaned corporate inventory temporarily released to Megan strictly for the duration of the dinner. The specific legal framework meant she possessed absolutely zero ownership rights over the stones. Mitchell lowered the document and delivered a brutal ultimatum. He pointed toward the two police officers who were dragging her handcuffed father toward the kitchen exit. He warned her that if she refused to hand the necklace to Corey and attempted to step through the mahogany doors wearing corporate property, he would immediately flag the officers down. Mitchell promised he would press charges against her for the felony theft of a priceless historical asset. He swore he would ensure she was instantly arrested for grand larceny, placed in steel handcuffs right next to her father, and locked in a holding cell. The crushing reality of Mitchell's legal threat slammed into Megan with devastating force. The defiant fire in her eyes instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. She looked at the stark white inventory document in Mitchell's hand, realizing she had absolutely no legal leverage left. She looked at Corey's outstretched, unmoving hand. She looked at the police officers actively hauling her ruined family out of the ballroom. She was completely surrounded, entirely outmaneuvered, and legally trapped. Her hands began to shake violently as she slowly reached up to the back of her neck. She fumbled helplessly with the intricate platinum clasp, her fingers slipping against the cold metal. The brilliant diamonds felt impossibly heavy against her skin. She finally managed to release the locking mechanism. She pulled the priceless heirloom away from her collarbone, her face completely drained of color. She avoided Corey's eyes as she surrendered the necklace, dropping the heavy, glittering stones directly into his open palm. She had lost the fortune, she had lost her family, and she had surrendered her final piece of leverage. The complete financial execution was officially finished. Megan's fingers lingered on the platinum clasp, her breathing escalating into a frantic, ragged hyperventilation. The heavy, glittering stones slipped from her collarbone, but she refused to fully release her grip. She clung to the delicate platinum webbing as if it were a physical tether to her vanished future. Her chest heaved violently beneath the ruined silk of her wedding gown. She looked up at Corey, her blue eyes wide, completely consumed by primal terror. She realized letting the diamonds fall into his palm represented the absolute irreversible end of her luxurious existence. She dropped heavily onto her bruised knees, ignoring the sharp shards of crystal scattered across the polished marble floor. She wrapped her free hand desperately around Corey's wrist, her manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo. She began to beg. Her voice lost its cultured polish, devolving into a pathetic guttural whine. She shrieked that she was profoundly sorry for the prenuptial agreement, the deception, and the cruel manipulation. She swore that the undeniable stress of her parents' extreme financial demands had forced her into making terrible decisions. She cried that she truly loved him from the very beginning. She promised to change everything about herself immediately. She vowed to be the fiercely loyal, dedicated wife he deserved. She pleaded for a second chance, begging him to look past the lies and build a new, honest life together. Corey remained entirely silent. He did not pull his wrist away from her frantic digging fingers. He simply looked down at her with an expression of absolute, unyielding detachment. His face was a mask of carved granite, completely impervious to the hysterical, theatrical display unfolding at his feet. He kept his right hand extended, his open palm steady and demanding. He did not need to utter a single syllable to communicate his absolute resolve. The suffocating weight of his silence crushed her frantic pleas. Megan stared into his cold, apathetic eyes and finally understood that the man she thought she had perfectly manipulated was completely gone. Her desperate facade shattered. Her trembling fingers finally released their iron grip on the platinum webbing. She unhooked the last remaining mechanism of the heavy vintage necklace and allowed the priceless heirloom to drop freely into his open palm. The cool, solid weight of the diamonds settled against Corey's skin. He closed his fingers around the glittering stones, reclaiming the only pure thing left in the room. As he held his mother's legacy, a bitter memory sliced through his mind. He vividly remembered the Tuesday evening 4 months ago when he first showed Megan the antique jewelry. He had opened the velvet box with reverence, explaining the profound historical and emotional significance of the intricate platinum setting. Megan had smiled sweetly, performing the role of the deeply touched fiancé flawlessly. Later that same evening, Corey had silently returned to their shared apartment to retrieve a forgotten laptop. He had walked past the master bedroom and heard Megan speaking loudly on her phone to her mother. He had stood completely frozen in the hallway, listening as Megan viciously mocked the vintage setting. She had laughed cruelly, describing the priceless family heirloom as outdated, cheap trash that belonged in a dusty pawnshop. She had bragged to Victoria that she would tolerate the ugly stones for the wedding ceremony, but explicitly planned to rip the diamonds out and melt the platinum down for a vastly more expensive redesign the moment the marriage certificate was legally binding. Her sudden reverence for the necklace tonight, her pathetic weeping over the very same jewelry she had degraded physically, disgusted him. The memory cemented his absolute lack of mercy. He smoothly slipped the heavy diamond necklace back into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, locking away his mother's legacy. Across the shattered dance floor, the brutal reality of the federal embezzlement charges fully materialized. The two uniformed police officers swiftly moved to secure their high-profile targets. The senior officer had already clamped heavy steel handcuffs securely around Charles Hastings's wrists. Charles stood entirely defeated, his shoulders slumped, his tailored suit stained with spilled champagne, and his aristocratic pride completely obliterated. The junior officer stepped purposefully toward Victoria. The matriarch instantly recoiled, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She violently slapped the officer's hands away, shrieking that she was a prominent member of elite society and absolutely refused to be treated like a common criminal. She loudly threatened to destroy the officer's career, screaming that her lawyers would have his badge by morning. Her aggressive, entitled resistance was completely futile. The officer moved with trained, uncompromising efficiency. He grabbed her flailing arms forcefully, twisting them behind her back. The metallic clink of the heavy handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. Victoria twisted against the officer's grip. Her elaborate hairstyle unraveled and her expensive diamond bracelet scratched uselessly against the cold steel binding her wrists. The officers began to forcibly march the ruined couple toward the grand mahogany doors. As they dragged her past the center table, Victoria locked her furious, terrified eyes onto her daughter. She dug her high heels into the marble floor, desperately resisting the officer's momentum. She screamed at the top of her lungs, ordering Megan to do something immediately. She shrieked that Megan needed to fix this catastrophic failure, demanding she manipulate Corey into paying their bail and hiring an elite federal defense team. Victoria's voice cracked with raw, primal panic as she disappeared into the dimly lit hallway, her frantic demands echoing down the corridor until the heavy wooden doors swung firmly shut behind them. Megan remained frozen on her hands and knees. She stared at the closed mahogany doors, the desperate echoes of her mother's screams ringing in her ears. The sudden, absolute silence of the grand ballroom was deafening. She slowly turned her head, her wide, terrified eyes scanning the sprawling, opulent space. The champagne pyramid lay in a ruined, glittering heap, the extravagant floral arrangements wilted under the harsh lights. The elite guests, the people she had spent her life trying to impress, stared down at her with expressions of naked disgust and profound apathy. Nobody stepped forward to offer a comforting hand. Nobody whispered a single word of sympathy. She looked up at Corey, who was already turning his back on her, walking calmly away alongside Lawyer Mitchell and me. The absolute finality of her situation crashed down upon her with the crushing force of a concrete vault. She had failed to secure the federal medical contract. She had lost the worthless startup equity. She surrendered the priceless diamond necklace. Both of her parents were currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser, facing 3 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The hillside mansion would be seized by my holding company at dawn. Her luxury cars, her designer wardrobe, and her entire trust fund were completely vaporized. Megan pressed her forehead against the cold marble floor, her manicured hands trembling violently amidst the broken crystal. She was entirely stripped bare. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that she was now completely homeless, entirely penniless, and utterly abandoned. Megan slowly lifted her head from the cold marble floor. The grand mahogany doors at the back of the Wellington Country Club ballroom had firmly swung shut, swallowing the frantic echoes of her mother's desperate screams. The heavy silence that settled over the remaining high society guests was absolute and suffocating. Megan looked at the shattered remains of the crystal champagne pyramid, the spilled vintage wine pooling around her ruined silk wedding gown. She turned her head and watched Corey walking away from her, his posture radiating a profound, unyielding detachment. She realized instantly that Corey was no longer a viable target. The brilliant visionary software developer she had spent 8 meticulous months isolating and manipulating had completely severed his emotional tether to her. He had reclaimed his mother's priceless diamond necklace and mentally erased Megan from his existence. She shifted her terrified blue eyes toward the only remaining source of power in the room. She locked her desperate gaze directly onto me. I stood near the edge of the ruined head table, my hands resting comfortably at my sides, watching her meticulously constructed aristocratic facade crumble into pathetic ash. Megan recognized that I was the true architect of her absolute destruction. I was the silent, invisible force that held the deeds to her family's hillside mansion, the titles to their luxury vehicles, and the absolute control over the massive federal medical contract. She decided to launch one final, incredibly desperate campaign for survival. She dragged her bruised knees across the floor, ignoring the sharp shards of broken glass that tore into the delicate fabric of her expensive dress. She crawled directly toward my polished leather shoes, her chest heaving with manufactured theatrical sobs. She threw her head back and looked up at me, weaponizing her tears in a pathetic attempt to elicit a single ounce of paternal sympathy. She began to frantically rewrite the entire history of her relationship with my son. She stammered that she was a helpless victim in a much larger, highly toxic corporate game. She pointed a shaking finger toward the mahogany doors where the police had just dragged her handcuffed parents. She loudly declared that Charles and Victoria Hastings were vicious, controlling monsters who had forcefully orchestrated the entire wicked scheme. She shrieked that her father had aggressively ordered her to secure Corey's technology fortune to cover up his massive federal embezzlement crimes. She claimed her mother had subjected her to relentless psychological abuse, threatening to disown her if she did not execute the brutal isolation tactics against Corey. She sobbed that she had never wanted to lie, manipulate, or steal. She painted herself as an innocent, terrified pawn who was simply following the cruel dictates of a corrupt and bankrupt family dynasty. She begged me to believe that deep down, she possessed a good heart that had been tragically corrupted by her parents' insatiable greed. I did not move a single muscle. I looked down at the weeping woman groveling at my feet with an expression of pure, unadulterated apathy. Her desperate willingness to violently throw her own parents to the wolves the very second her wealth was threatened only cemented my absolute disgust for her. Megan realized her emotional manipulation was failing to penetrate my stoic exterior. She abruptly shifted her strategy from seeking total forgiveness to begging for a basic, foundational survival concession. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest and pleaded for mercy. She cried that she understood she had permanently lost Corey the federal contract and her elite social standing. She accepted that her family was entirely ruined and destined for a maximum security federal penitentiary. She simply asked me to leave her with one single solitary asset so she would not be thrown out onto the unforgiving streets. She begged me to let her keep the massive, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse apartment she currently resided in downtown. She reasoned that since she was suddenly an orphan of high society, she desperately needed a safe, secure sanctuary to rebuild her shattered life. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her request hung in the quiet ballroom. After participating in a coordinated effort to steal a $40 million medical empire, she believed she was still fundamentally entitled to reside in a premium top-tier luxury high-rise. I looked directly into her pleading, tear-filled eyes. I did not offer her a warm smile or a comforting word. I simply reached my right hand into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I bypassed my silver pen and my phone, my fingers closing around a crisp, thickly folded piece of stark white paper. I smoothly withdrew the document and held it out in front of me, ensuring the bright chandelier light caught the highly official legal seals stamped across the top of the page. I spoke with a voice that carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a judge delivering a final execution order. I informed Megan that my financial reach extended vastly further than her father's toxic commercial business loans and heavily overdue car leases. I unfolded the crisp document and read the bold black lettering aloud for the entire captive audience to hear. It was a strict, uncompromising, and immediate notice of eviction. I looked down at her completely bewildered face and calmly explained the structural realities of the local commercial real estate market. I revealed that her exclusive, highly coveted downtown luxury apartment building was not independently owned. It was actually heavily managed and entirely operated by one of my numerous anonymous corporate subsidiaries. I explicitly confirmed that I was her ultimate absolute landlord. Megan's jaw dropped open. The color completely drained from her face as the terrifying implications of my words washed over her. I did not give her a single second to interrupt or formulate a counter-argument. I seamlessly delivered the brutal drip-fed backstory that I had meticulously kept hidden for the past 14 days. I told her that exactly 2 weeks ago, while she was actively mocking my vintage clothing and aggressively plotting to liquidate my son's medical startup, I had quietly purchased her entire residential tower using pure liquid cash. The very moment the ink dried on the commercial real estate contract, I initiated the final phase of her total displacement. I explained that I had personally contacted the executive building manager this afternoon with a set of highly specific, uncompromising instructions. I told Megan that the exact moment she sat down at the head table tonight and took her very first sip of vintage champagne, my private security team and the building's maintenance staff had used a master key to enter her pristine penthouse suite. I described the coordinated operation with cold, terrifying precision. I informed her that the maintenance staff did not use premium moving boxes or delicate packing materials. They had systematically swept through her massive closets and elegant bathrooms, shoving her entire collection of designer dresses, her wildly expensive luxury shoes, and her premium imported makeup directly into heavy, thick, black industrial garbage bags. I stated that her entire fabricated existence had been forcefully bagged up like common refuse. I looked at the eviction notice in my hand and read the final unyielding clause. I announced that her lease had been officially and permanently terminated due to gross financial insolvency. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to leave the Wellington Country Club, travel back to the downtown sector, and clear her miserable belongings from my premium residential property. A sudden sharp buzzing sound interrupted the heavy silence of the ballroom. The noise originated from the small silver designer clutch resting on the marble floor near Megan's knees. She slowly shifted her terrified gaze away from my face and looked down at her vibrating smartphone. Her trembling fingers reached out and picked up the device. The bright, glaring screen illuminated her pale, tear-stained face. The executive building manager had just sent her a direct text message containing a single high-definition photograph. Megan stared at the digital image, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated horror. The photograph clearly displayed the wet, rain-slicked concrete curb directly outside the grand glass entrance of her former luxury high-rise. Stacked haphazardly on the dirty sidewalk, entirely exposed to the harsh elements and the judgmental stares of passing pedestrians, were exactly 25 heavy black plastic garbage bags. Her entire life, her entire identity, and her entire hoarded wealth had been literally thrown out onto the street with the common trash. The photograph was the ultimate, undeniable visual confirmation of her absolute ruin. The last remaining thread of her fractured sanity completely snapped. A raw, guttural scream of pure animalistic fury ripped from her throat. She dropped the phone onto the floor, her face contorting into a mask of pure, violent hatred. She lunged upward from the shattered glass, her hands hooked into vicious claws, launching her body directly at my face. Megan propelled herself forward with a reckless, uncoordinated velocity. Her high heels slipped dangerously against the slick, polished marble, but the pure adrenaline of total dispossession fueled her upward trajectory. Her expensive silk gown tore against the sharp fragments of the shattered champagne pyramid, but she completely ignored the physical damage. Her hands curled into sharp, desperate claws, her manicured fingers aiming directly for my face. She let out a guttural, feral screech that completely shattered any remaining illusion of her refined, high society upbringing. She was no longer a wealthy heiress gracefully navigating a ballroom. She was a terrified, cornered animal reacting to the absolute obliteration of her reality. I did not flinch. I did not even raise my arms to defend my face. I knew I did not have to. Corey reacted with blinding speed and flawless precision. He stepped fluidly out from the shadows of the ruined head table and planted his broad frame squarely between me and the incoming threat. He did not brace for a violent, aggressive impact. He simply raised his hands and caught both of her slender wrists in midair, stopping her frantic lunge instantly. The sudden interception completely halted her violent momentum. Megan thrashed wildly against his grip, kicking her feet and sobbing uncontrollably, demanding he let her go. Corey did not squeeze her wrist to inflict pain, but his hold was absolutely unbreakable. He absorbed her frantic, weak struggles with cold, unyielding resolve. He allowed her to exhaust her final burst of adrenaline, watching her thrash until her energy rapidly depleted. Then, with a fluid, measured motion, he pushed her gently but firmly backward. The physical boundary was established with absolute finality. Megan stumbled backward, her ruined silk dress tangling around her ankles, and collapsed onto the floor once again. She looked up at the man she had planned to systematically bleed dry, completely drained of her fighting spirit. Corey stood tall over her, his broad shoulders squared, radiating a quiet, imposing authority. He looked down at the woman who had spent nearly a year orchestrating a massive multi-million-dollar extortion plot against his life. He spoke with a voice that was eerily calm, completely devoid of any lingering anger or residual heartbreak. He informed Megan that the elaborate, cruel game she had constructed was permanently and irreversibly over. He told her there would be no final negotiations, no desperate second chances, and absolutely no secret financial settlements to save her from the unforgiving streets. He stated that she had played her final deceitful hand and lost absolutely everything in the process. Corey did not wait for a response or another theatrical plea. He did not give her the satisfaction of a prolonged, dramatic farewell. He simply turned his back on her, effectively erasing her from his vision and his future. He looked across the vast, chaotic expanse of the grand ballroom and signaled to the head captain of the catering staff. He projected his voice clearly, instructing the remaining waitstaff to immediately clear the tables and begin breaking down the opulent decorations. The grand engagement dinner, financed entirely by my anonymous holding company, transitioned instantly into a brutal, highly efficient dismantling operation. The staff, moving with rapid, synchronized precision, began stripping the expensive silk tablecloths from the heavy wooden tables. They dismantled the massive imported floral centerpieces, tossing the vibrant orchids into large waste bins. They swept away the shattered crystal and discarded the personalized place cards. The swift mechanical breakdown of the room perfectly mirrored the absolute dismantling of the Hastings family. I watched my son closely as he turned away from the wreckage of his former relationship. A massive, palpable wave of relief visibly washed over his entire demeanor. The rigid tension that had locked his jaw and stiffened his posture for the past 30 days completely evaporated. The immense psychological burden he had carried in silence was finally lifted. For 8 long, agonizing months, Corey had played the role of the naive, love-struck fool to absolute perfection. He had endured Megan's subtle, deeply ingrained racism with a forced, compliant smile, never letting her see the profound disgust brewing behind his eyes. He had listened to her condescending remarks about his working-class background, silently absorbing every elitist insult she casually threw at him during their private dinners and public galas. He had witnessed her overt, insatiable greed as she demanded increasingly extravagant gifts, luxury vacations, and forcefully pushed for the accelerated wedding timeline to secure his non-existent wealth. He never broke character. He never allowed a single flash of his true intelligence or his fierce loyalty to me to penetrate his carefully constructed facade of blind devotion. He subjected himself to her highly toxic, manipulative environment solely to gather enough concrete, actionable evidence to destroy her family legally. He had meticulously documented every suspicious bank transfer, recorded every questionable conversation with her father, and forwarded every piece of critical financial intelligence directly to my forensic accounting team. He had sacrificed his own peace of mind, enduring her toxic presence day after day, to ensure that Charles and Victoria Hastings could never victimize another innocent person again. Standing amidst the rapid deconstruction of the ballroom, Corey looked at me and offered a small, genuine nod of solidarity. The exhausting, high-stakes undercover operation was finally successfully complete. The club manager, a man who had spent the entire evening navigating a state of near-constant panic, cautiously approached my position near the edge of the dance floor. He nervously adjusted his tailored suit jacket and cleared his throat, desperate to restore a sense of normalcy to his prestigious venue. He respectfully asked me for final instructions regarding the remaining catering arrangements. He gestured toward the massive buffet tables lining the far wall of the ballroom. The long stations were heavily loaded with untouched gourmet delicacies. Mountains of chilled beluga caviar, perfectly seared prime rib carving stations, massive displays of imported artisan cheeses, and dozens of unopened bottles of premium vintage champagne sat entirely undisturbed. The exorbitant feast had been meticulously prepared for a high society crowd that was now fleeing the premises or sitting in the back of a police cruiser. The manager asked if he should instruct the kitchen staff to discard the expensive provisions into the commercial dumpsters. I looked at the decadent spread, and then down at Megan, who was still weeping softly on the bare floor, completely ignored by the busy staff. I turned back to the manager and issued a final unyielding directive. I instructed him to mobilize his entire culinary team immediately. I ordered him to carefully pack every single ounce of the untouched gourmet food and every remaining bottle of premium beverage into secure temperature-controlled transport containers. I demanded that the entire extravagant feast be loaded into delivery vans and transported directly to a specific severely underfunded homeless shelter operating in the heart of South Chicago. I ensured that the opulent meal, originally intended to celebrate a massive corporate theft and a fake union, would instead feed the working-class citizens the Hastings family had so deeply and openly despised. 2 private security guards materialized from the shadows of the ballroom entrance. They did not wait for Megan to gather her composure. They stepped onto the shattered glass, flanked her trembling body, and firmly grabbed her upper arms. They hoisted her from the cold marble floor, indifferent to the tearing fabric of her extravagant silk wedding gown. Her legs were weak, practically dragging beneath her as they marched her forward. The engagement dinner had transformed into a public execution, and she was the final casualty. The high society guests, the socialites she had spent her life trying to impress, parted like the Red Sea. They stepped back, pulling their expensive coats out of her path, treating her as if she carried a contagious disease. There were no whispered sympathies. There were no hands reaching out to offer comfort. The wealthy elite operated on a ruthless hierarchy of power, and Megan had just been publicly stripped of it. She was forced to walk the agonizing length of the Wellington Country Club ballroom under the searing, judgmental stares of her former peers. Every step was a brutal reminder of her new reality. The luxurious life she had lied to obtain was dissolving around her. She kept her head down, her face burning with profound shame as the mahogany doors swung open to reveal the cavernous main lobby. The pristine lobby offered no sanctuary. The security guards maintained their iron grip on her arms, marching her past the towering marble columns and cascading crystal chandeliers. They reached the glass entrance doors and pushed them open, thrusting Megan out into the damp, freezing night air. The sudden drop in temperature hit her bare shoulders, making her shiver violently beneath the ruined silk of her dress. The guards released her simultaneously, stepping back inside and pulling the heavy glass doors shut with a definitive thud. The lock engaged immediately. Megan stumbled forward onto the wet concrete of the valet staging area. She stood alone under the harsh lights of the club's exterior awning. Directly in front of her, the circular driveway was packed with a glittering fleet of luxury vehicles. Sleek black Bentleys, aggressively styled Ferraris, and armored Mercedes SUVs sat idling, waiting for their wealthy owners to emerge. Just yesterday, Megan had viewed these exact machines as her absolute birthright. She had expected to glide out of this building on Corey's arm, step into a limousine, and return to her penthouse. Now she was standing on the wet pavement wearing an expensive designer dress she had no way of paying for, staring at a world she was permanently locked out of. She wrapped her arms tightly around her torso, shivering uncontrollably, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her immediate poverty. Corey and I walked out through those exact same glass doors 30 seconds later. We did not alert her to our presence. We did not offer any gloating remarks or victorious cheers. We simply stood on the top step of the entrance looking down at her shivering form. Our absolute, unyielding silence was the heaviest, most crushing punishment we could possibly inflict. It communicated a total, permanent erasure of her existence from our lives. She was no longer a threat or a memory. She was simply a stranger standing in the cold. I rested my calloused hands on the polished brass railing and took a deep breath of the crisp night air. Watching Megan shiver on the wet concrete triggered a deeply ingrained memory from 4 decades ago. In the 1980s, I was a young, exhausted man wearing a cheap suit, walking out of heavily guarded bank lobbies across the financial district. I remembered the distinct, humiliating sound of heavy glass doors locking behind me. I remembered the condescending smiles of the white loan officers who repeatedly denied my commercial applications. They did not reject me because my business models were flawed. They rejected me solely and systematically because of the color of my skin. They looked at my calloused hands and decided I was fundamentally unworthy of handling their capital. They had treated me exactly like an unwanted trespasser in their pristine corporate world. I had swallowed that bitter humiliation day after day, channeling the burning rejection into an unbreakable drive to succeed. I built my holding company in the dark, operating through proxy firms and leveraging my son's technological genius circumventing the corrupt gatekeepers who tried to starve me out. Now the dynamic was irreversibly inverted. I held absolute power, and the very people who had built their high society castles on exclusionary greed were the ones sleeping on the street. Megan realized we were standing behind her. She did not turn around. The crushing weight of our silent observation forced her into frantic action. She reached into her silver designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone. Her fingers were shaking so violently she nearly dropped the device onto the wet concrete. She opened a rideshare application, frantically tapping the screen to order a luxury black car to take her away from this nightmare. She selected her destination, ignoring the fact that her downtown penthouse was already being cleared out by my maintenance staff. She hit the confirmation button and waited for the digital approval. A stark red notification banner instantly illuminated her pale face. Her primary platinum credit card had been heavily declined. She gasped quickly, navigating to her digital wallet to select a secondary payment method. She tapped the screen again, her breathing escalating into a rapid hyperventilation. Another red banner flashed across the glass. Declined. She tried a third card, a joint account linked directly to her father's primary import-export firm. The screen flashed a terminal error message indicating the account was currently frozen under federal investigation. Megan stared at the glowing rectangle in absolute terror. The instant freezing of the Hastings family assets and her own immediate financial termination had hit the banking servers with lightning speed. She was stranded in the freezing cold miles away from the city center without a single dollar to her name. She could not even afford a basic cab ride. The suffocating silence of the valet driveway was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive electronic ringing. The jarring sound did not originate from Megan's useless device. Corey reached into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket, bypassing the heavy diamond necklace he just reclaimed, and pulled out his encrypted corporate smartphone. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dark. It was his lead software developer, a brilliant but highly anxious engineer who exclusively ran the server architecture for his medical technology startup. This specific priority line was strictly reserved for catastrophic system failures. Corey frowned, the personal victory of the evening instantly overridden by a massive looming professional emergency. He slid his thumb across the screen to answer the call, lifting the device to his ear. Before Corey could even utter a greeting, the lead developer's frantic, breathless voice blared through the receiver. He shouted that they had a critical situation unfolding at the headquarters. The secure federal server farm holding the encrypted data for the $40 million government medical contract was actively under a highly sophisticated, coordinated cyber attack. Corey gripped the encrypted smartphone tightly against his ear, listening intently to his lead developer frantically outline the escalating situation. The supposed cyber attack triggering the catastrophic security alarms was not a foreign hacking syndicate attempting to steal proprietary medical algorithms. It was a massive, highly coordinated data scrape executed by top-tier investigative journalists and relentless federal oversight auditors. The explosive news of Charles Hastings and his dramatic federal arrest had already leaked to the major media syndicates. The digital perimeter of Corey's medical technology startup was being aggressively probed by reporters desperately searching for a tangible financial connection between the disgraced patriarch and Corey's upcoming government contract. Corey instructed the lead developer to initiate a total server lockdown and sever all external access protocols immediately. He demanded that every firewall be reinforced and every redundant data node be isolated from the primary network grid to ensure absolute data integrity. He ended the call and looked at me, his jaw clenched tight. The immense relief he had felt just moments ago in the ruined ballroom was instantly replaced by a new, rapidly escalating corporate nightmare. The $40 million federal medical contract, the crowning achievement of his professional career, was in severe jeopardy. If the strict government oversight committees believed his startup was financially entangled with a man currently sitting in a federal holding cell for massive corporate embezzlement, they would terminate the lucrative contract before sunrise. His public association with the Hastings family, specifically his highly publicized engagement to Megan, was now a toxic liability capable of destroying his entire company. We turned away from the glass doors of the Wellington Country Club, leaving Megan standing shivering on the wet concrete, and walked swiftly toward our modest, unmarked sedan waiting in the lower valet tier. I unlocked and slid into the driver's seat. Corey dropped heavily into the passenger side, immediately pulling his sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase. The dim streetlights illuminated the intense concentration etched across his face as he quickly booted up the machine. The glow from the screen cast sharp shadows across his jawline, highlighting the sheer exhaustion he had masked all evening. I started the engine and steered the sedan away from the opulent country club, merging onto the dark, rain-slicked highway, heading back toward the city center. I drove in silence for several minutes, allowing the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet asphalt to steady the heavy tension inside the cabin. I glanced over at my son. His fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard with practiced, relentless efficiency. I recognized the fierce, uncompromising determination burning in his dark eyes. It was the exact same survival instinct I had relied upon 4 decades ago when I first began constructing my holding company. I broke the heavy silence, my voice steady and resonant in the confined space of the moving vehicle. I told Corey that building a legitimate corporate empire requires vastly more than just brilliant software and a tireless work ethic. I explained that I had survived the ruthless corporate battles of the 1980s by mastering the absolute control of public narratives. When rival executives attempted to smear my reputation or actively lock me out of lucrative commercial real estate investments, I did not wait for the biased press to dictate my ultimate fate. I taught him the final, harshest lesson of modern business. I stated clearly that the fundamental truth of any given situation only matters if you are the one actively holding the microphone. If you allow your enemies or the ravenous media to tell your story first, you become a permanent victim of their skewed interpretation. You must strike the definitive blow and completely control the dissemination of public information. Corey absorbed my words without breaking his intense focus on the glowing screen. He nodded slowly, fully internalizing the brutal reality of the corporate battlefield. He opened a blank digital document and began to draft an official press release. He did not write a polite, carefully worded public relations statement designed to minimize collateral damage or soothe wounded egos. He weaponized the keyboard, crafting a brutal, uncompromising declaration of total separation. He typed out a crystal-clear, unequivocal denunciation of Charles Hastings. He explicitly condemned the staggering financial crimes and federal embezzlement charges, ensuring there was absolutely zero ambiguity regarding his personal and professional moral stance. He refused to offer any polite platitudes regarding the ongoing federal investigation, choosing instead to distance himself entirely from the disgraced family patriarch. He meticulously detailed the rigid, impenetrable financial firewalls surrounding his medical technology startup, providing preemptive, verifiable proof that not a single cent of illicit Hastings capital had ever touched his company ledgers. Then he delivered the final definitive strike. Corey formally and publicly announced the immediate permanent cancellation of his engagement to Megan Hastings. He drafted the cancellation with cold legal precision, stripping away any lingering romantic sentiment or emotional attachment. He framed the broken relationship as a necessary ethical purge to protect the absolute integrity of his company and the sanctity of the federal medical contract. He reviewed the sharp, devastating paragraphs one final time. The document was a flawless masterclass in corporate survival, a highly lethal public relations maneuver perfectly designed to amputate the rotting limb of the Hastings family before the toxic infection could spread to his life's work. Corey routed the completed document through his secure corporate servers, attaching his verified digital executive signature. He targeted the release directly to every major financial news network, federal oversight committee, and prominent business syndicate simultaneously. He pressed the enter key, launching the uncompromising narrative into the global digital ether. We drove in tense silence as the massive data packets hit the public wires. Less than 10 minutes later, the violent ripples of his decisive action began to register on the global market trackers. Corey refreshed his dynamic financial dashboard. The initial terrifying downward dip in his company's projected valuation instantly halted. Then the numbers began to climb. The stock projections surged upward with aggressive, unprecedented momentum. The elite investors and strict federal auditors did not panic over the broken engagement. They responded to his swift, ruthless dismantling of the Hastings connection with overwhelming public approval. They recognized a strong leader who prioritized ethical boundaries and corporate security over a prestigious high society alliance. The decisive anti-corruption stance solidified their absolute confidence in his executive leadership. The market responded to strength, and Corey had demonstrated an abundance of it. The $40 million federal medical contract was completely secured, insulated by his preemptive media strike. The immediate public relations crisis was entirely averted. Corey closed his laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, leaning back against the leather passenger seat as a deep, shuddering exhale finally left his lungs. The brutal engagement dinner and the subsequent media nightmare were concluded. However, as I navigated the sedan off the highway exit toward the towering glass structure of our corporate headquarters, Corey's encrypted phone vibrated once. The battle for his personal life was finished, but he looked down at the glowing notification and realized a final, highly sensitive loose end remained waiting for us in the executive boardroom. The crisp morning sunlight reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of the corporate headquarters. Corey and I walked through the revolving doors, leaving the brisk city air behind us as we entered the cavernous, climate-controlled lobby. The pristine expanse of white marble and brushed steel usually projected an atmosphere of absolute, untouchable authority. Today, however, the immaculate corporate sanctuary had been breached by the final, desperate anomaly from the previous night's destruction. The urgent notification Corey had received in the sedan was not another digital attack but a physical perimeter alert. Megan was already waiting for us. She was squatting near the base of a massive structural pillar directly intercepting the path to the private executive elevators. The polished aristocratic grace she had wielded for the past 8 months was completely eradicated. She looked entirely disheveled, manic, and highly volatile. She was still wearing the same ruined, dirt-stained silk wedding gown from the country club, the delicate fabric now torn and smelling faintly of stale champagne and wet asphalt. Her blonde hair hung in greasy, tangled strands around her pale face, and her makeup was heavily smeared across her cheeks. She had clearly spent the entire night pacing the cold city streets after my property management team had dumped her belongings onto the curb. As soon as she spotted our approach, she pushed herself up from the floor with a sudden jerky aggression, completely ignoring the wary glances of the arriving corporate employees. Megan aggressively blocked our path, planting her bruised feet firmly on the polished marble. She did not offer apologies or attempt to play the fragile victim. She immediately launched into a vicious, highly calculated extortion attempt. She reached into her silver designer clutch and produced a crumpled, hastily printed legal document. She waved the papers frantically in Corey's face, her voice echoing sharply across the silent lobby. She demanded a massive multi-million-dollar severance package to compensate for her severe emotional damages and abrupt residential displacement. She shrieked that she had spent the entire night contacting rogue journalists and predatory gossip columnists. She threatened to launch a devastating fabricated media campaign accusing Corey of severe domestic cruelty, psychological abuse, and corporate malfeasance. She swore she would relentlessly drag his newly secured federal medical contract through the mud, guaranteeing the government oversight committees would instantly revoke their funding due to the sheer volume of negative public relations. She thrust the crumpled papers forward, declaring it was a standard non-disclosure agreement. She promised she would sign away her right to speak to the press and quietly vanish from the city forever, but only if Corey authorized an immediate, non-reversible wire transfer of $10 million into a secure offshore account. Corey did not break his stride. He did not flinch at her aggressive posturing, nor did he entertain a single syllable of her desperate financial demands. He simply stopped 2 feet away from her, his expression radiating a cold, impenetrable apathy. Before Megan could escalate her frantic shouting, the distinct chime of the private executive elevator echoed through the lobby. The brushed steel doors slid open and Lawyer Mitchell stepped out onto the marble floor. He was flanked by 2 towering, heavily armed corporate security contractors wearing dark suits and earpieces. Mitchell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and walked briskly toward our position, his heavy leather briefcase clutched firmly in his right hand. He did not acknowledge Megan's disheveled appearance or her hysterical threats. He bypassed her completely, standing shoulder to shoulder with Corey and me, projecting a unified, unbreakable front of absolute legal authority. Mitchell reached into his suit jacket and produced a thick, professionally bound legal folio. He did not hand it to Megan. He simply opened it, displaying a crisp white document bearing the unmistakable wet ink signature of a highly ranking district judge. Mitchell spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that effortlessly overpowered her frantic, threatening shrieks. He informed Megan that her crude attempt at financial negotiation was completely invalid. He read the strict parameters of the document aloud, ensuring every word resonated clearly through the cavernous lobby. It was a finalized, permanent, and entirely non-negotiable restraining order. Mitchell explained that the judicial mandate legally prohibited Megan from coming within 500 feet of Corey, me, our private residences, or any of our corporate holdings. He explicitly stated that her current presence in the headquarters was a direct violation of the injunction. He pointed a steady finger at the crumpled non-disclosure agreement trembling in her hand. He warned her that demanding a massive financial payout under the explicit threat of launching a fabricated public smear campaign was legally classified as criminal extortion. If she spoke another word to Corey or attempted to negotiate any further, Mitchell promised he would instruct the armed guards to arrest her immediately for felony blackmail. Megan's eyes darted wildly between the official restraining order and Mitchell's uncompromising glare. She opened her mouth to scream another threat, but Mitchell swiftly cut her off, delivering a brutal drip-fed backstory that permanently dismantled her remaining confidence. He explained that my forensic legal team had not slept a single minute during the previous night. While the media was busy covering her father's dramatic federal arrest, Mitchell's investigators had combed through heavily sealed civil dockets, buried settlement agreements, and redacted court transcripts across multiple state lines. They had completely uncovered her hidden operational blueprint. Mitchell revealed to the silent lobby that Megan was not a desperate woman reacting poorly to a broken engagement. She was a calculated serial predator. The investigators discovered she had successfully executed this exact same extortion scam on 2 other wealthy technology executives over the past 4 years, once in California and once in New York. In both previous instances, she had utilized fabricated pregnancies, emotional blackmail, and the threat of public scandal to secure quiet, highly lucrative out-of-court settlements. Mitchell looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. He stated clearly that she had relied on the cowardice of men who were too afraid of negative publicity to fight back. He delivered the final crushing blow, informing her that she had finally targeted a family equipped with the unlimited resources required to hunt her past, expose her crimes, and permanently neutralize her threat. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of Mitchell's revelation slammed into Megan with devastating physical force. She stared blankly at the official judicial signature on the restraining order, her mind frantically trying to process the absolute collapse of her predatory career. The realization hit her that she possessed absolutely zero legal leverage. Her historical extortion patterns were entirely exposed. Her parents were facing decades in federal prison. Her assets had been seized, and her current threats were legally classified as prosecutable felonies. The final thread of her aristocratic facade violently snapped. She erupted into a state of pure, unadulterated feral fury. She screamed violent, incomprehensible obscenities, her face turning crimson as she lunged forward in a completely blind, irrational attack. The 2 armed security guards reacted instantly. They stepped forward with trained, uncompromising efficiency, intercepting her frantic lunge before she could even cross the physical boundary. They grabbed her firmly by her upper arms, completely ignoring her vicious thrashing and hysterical shrieking. They lifted her struggling body off the polished marble floor, forcing her backward toward the exit. Megan kicked her bare, bruised feet helplessly against the air, her ruined silk gown dragging heavily across the pristine lobby. She cursed Corey, she cursed me, and she cursed the entire corporate establishment as the guards dragged her relentlessly toward the glass revolving doors. Corey and I turned our backs on the pathetic spectacle. We stepped smoothly into the waiting executive elevator. I turned around just as the brushed steel doors began to slide shut, catching one final glimpse of Megan being violently ejected from the building, her body shoved unceremoniously out onto the bustling, unforgiving city pavement. The heavy glass doors locked securely behind her, sealing the corporate fortress. The physical and legal purge of the Hastings family was now fully and permanently complete. The brushed steel doors of the private executive elevator slid shut with a smooth, heavy finality. The chaotic scene in the main corporate lobby, the frantic screaming of the ruined heiress, and the forceful intervention of the armed security contractors were instantly severed from our immediate reality. The reinforced glass cabin ascended rapidly toward the highest floor of the towering glass structure. I stood beside my son in the absolute silence of the rising elevator. The digital floor indicator chimed softly, marking our steady upward progress away from the toxic wreckage we had successfully navigated. Corey leaned heavily against the polished glass wall, staring out at the sprawling, illuminated grid of the sprawling city skyline below. The potent adrenaline that had fueled his precise, uncompromising execution of the massive public relations strike and the brutal legal confrontation was rapidly draining from his system. The physical threat posed by the Hastings family was officially and permanently neutralized. Megan was stranded on the street, Charles and Victoria were facing immediate federal incarceration, and the corporate extortion plot was completely dismantled. However, the emotional toll of the protracted conflict immediately rushed in to fill the sudden vacuum. The elevator eased to a gentle halt. The doors opened to reveal the vast, impeccably designed executive boardroom. The space was entirely deserted, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the recessed ceiling lights. The sprawling mahogany conference table stretched across the center of the room, surrounded by empty leather chairs. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the quiet boardroom felt incredibly vast and profoundly isolating. Corey stepped out of the elevator and walked slowly across the thick, sound-absorbing carpet. He bypassed the head of the conference table and moved directly to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. He unbuttoned the collar of his dress shirt, pulling away the dark silk tie with a heavy, exhausted sigh. He pressed his palms against the cool glass, his broad shoulders rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. He had to finally address the intense psychological wreckage accumulated over the past 8 months. The undercover operation had required an agonizing level of sustained mental discipline. He had forced himself to smile warmly at a woman he fundamentally despised. He had shared meals with a family that viewed his working-class origins with naked, unadulterated contempt. He had actively suppressed his own brilliant intellect, playing the role of a naive, easily manipulated software developer to keep their predatory instincts engaged. Every single day had been a suffocating exercise in extreme psychological endurance. He had systematically subjected himself to their elitist poison solely to gather the irrefutable evidence needed to protect our legacy. The sustained deception had nearly broken his spirit. He turned away from the massive window and looked across the empty boardroom. He met my gaze, his dark eyes reflecting a profound world-weary exhaustion. Corey walked over to the nearest leather chair and sank into the deep upholstery. He rested his elbows on the polished mahogany surface and buried his face in his calloused hands. The oppressive silence of the room stretched between us for a long moment. Finally, he lifted his head. He looked directly at me and spoke with a voice thick with raw, unfiltered gratitude. He thanked me for recognizing the lethal threat long before he could fully comprehend the impending danger. He expressed his profound appreciation for the unwavering, absolute protection I had meticulously provided. He acknowledged that if I had not recognized Megan's predatory nature, he would have undoubtedly fallen blindly into the permanent, inescapable trap of a highly toxic marriage. He stated that without my strategic intervention, the Hastings family would have successfully liquidated his $40 million medical technology startup and violently destroyed his entire future. I walked across the room and stood beside his chair. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, offering him the silent, steadfast validation he desperately needed. I told him that my fundamental duty as a father was to shield him from the exact type of ruthless exploitation I had faced decades ago. I expressed my absolute pride in his immense resilience and his flawless execution of the brutal countermeasures. We had fought the corporate war together, and we had emerged entirely victorious. I stepped away from his chair and walked toward the discreet wall safe embedded behind a framed architectural blueprint. I engaged the biometric scanner and pulled open the heavy steel door. I reached inside and retrieved a sleek black leather folio. I carried the folio back to the conference table and placed it directly in front of Corey. I did not offer a lengthy preamble. I simply opened the thick leather cover, revealing a final, freshly drafted legal document cleanly printed on premium parchment. Corey looked down at the paper, his exhausted eyes scanning the bold legal headers. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable deed of transfer. The legal document effectively dissolved the complex corporate shield we had successfully erected. It legally transferred 100% of the anonymous blind trust, including the complete ownership of his software startup, the federal medical contracts, and all liquid assets directly back into his personal name. I looked down at my son and delivered the final piece of the operational architecture. I explained that I had never harbored any desire to permanently control his staggering wealth. The blind trust was never a tool for paternal domination. It was simply a necessary, unbreakable armor designed to protect his vulnerable assets from sophisticated predators like Megan Hastings. I told Corey that when the threat of extortion was active, the blind trust served as a concrete wall that the Hastings family could not legally penetrate. They could not steal what he did not legally possess on paper. I explained that I had taken temporary absolute control of the corporate empire solely to absorb the immense legal liability and shield his genius from their aggressive sabotage. Now that the primary threat was entirely eliminated, the defensive armor was no longer required. The predators were imprisoned, evicted, and legally neutralized. The sprawling medical technology empire belonged fully and unequivocally to the rightful heir. Corey stared at the transfer deed. The heavy realization of his absolute unencumbered freedom washed over him. The grueling 8-month ordeal was not just a survival mission. It was a forged trial that had secured his permanent independence. He reached across the table and picked up my silver fountain pen. He did not hesitate. He pressed the nib to the parchment and signed his name with bold, decisive strokes across the bottom line. He reclaimed his destiny and his vast fortune with a single, irreversible signature. The entire psychological burden was permanently eradicated forever. Corey closed the leather folio and stood up, the oppressive exhaustion finally lifting from his shoulders. A genuine, relaxed smile spread across his face. He looked at me, a new, bright, lighter energy illuminating his exhausted eyes. He eagerly asked a single defining question to immediately guide the conversation forward. They desperately needed to figure out exactly how to celebrate their massive, hard-fought victory tonight without returning to the toxic, superficial, high society environment they had just completely conquered. The heavy glass doors of the corporate fortress glided shut behind us, sealing away the sterile marble lobby and the lingering phantom of Megan's hysterical departure. Corey and I stood side by side on the expansive concrete plaza fronting the headquarters. The crisp evening air had sharpened into a biting wind that whipped through the financial district. Towering skyscrapers of glass and steel loomed over us on all sides, their illuminated windows casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. This was the absolute epicenter of wealth and power in the city. Yet standing in the heart of the empire we had fought so ruthlessly to protect, a profound, suffocating sense of disconnect washed over both of us. The victory against the Hastings family was absolute. The legal firewalls were perfectly secured, and the transfer of the blind trust was entirely complete. However, the glittering skyline suddenly looked incredibly hollow. Corey stared up at the monolithic structures housing elite hedge funds and venture capital firms. He realized with a heavy settling certainty that the vast wealth surrounding us was inextricably linked to the sheer depravity we had just defeated. The high society world, Megan represented, a world obsessed with designer labels, superficial status, and predatory greed, felt entirely toxic. The millions of dollars resting securely in Corey's name felt less like a triumphant prize and more like a deeply isolating burden. He buttoned his wool overcoat, turning his back on the glowing corporate monoliths. The false smiles, the elaborate social masquerades, and the endless pursuit of unearned prestige had completely lost their appeal. We needed an immediate physical purge from the elite environment we currently inhabited. I led the way down the wide granite steps toward the private underground parking garage. We bypassed the fleet of chauffeured luxury SUVs and approached my modest, unmarked sedan. It was the exact same unassuming vehicle we had used to quietly navigate the city during the most intense phases of the undercover operation. Corey slid into the passenger seat without a word, staring blankly out the window as I started the engine. I navigated the sedan up the steep concrete ramp and merged seamlessly into the dense, aggressive flow of downtown traffic. The glowing neon signs of exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants lined the bustling avenue. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of idling sports cars, welcoming the city's elite into dimly lit dining rooms where single bottles of vintage wine cost more than a working-class family's monthly rent. Just a few hours ago, we had been sitting at the apex of that exact world, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and imported caviar. Now, the thought of sitting in another velvet-lined booth surrounded by people who measured human worth through stock portfolios and pedigree was physically repulsive. I did not ask Corey for his preferred destination. A silent mutual understanding dictated our trajectory. I gripped the steering wheel firmly, bypassed the glittering culinary district, and merged onto the southbound expressway. The transition was gradual but unmistakable. The towering glass facades slowly gave way to squat, functional brick warehouses and aging industrial complexes. The smooth, freshly paved avenues morphed into cracked asphalt lined with flickering, unreliable streetlights. We were driving directly away from the insulated bubble of extreme wealth and heading straight into the gritty, unforgiving reality of South Chicago. I pulled the sedan off the main arterial road and navigated through a series of narrow, dimly lit streets. We finally stopped in front of a low, flat-roofed building. The faded neon sign buzzing above the entrance flickered erratically, casting a harsh red glow across the wet pavement. It was a run-down, entirely unremarkable diner that had miraculously survived decades of urban decay and aggressive gentrification. We stepped out into the damp, freezing air and walked toward the entrance. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A small, tarnished brass bell chimed overhead, announcing our arrival. The immediate sensory shift was absolute and grounding. The sterile, odorless atmosphere of the corporate tower was replaced by the dense, comforting aroma of stale coffee, burnt sugar, and sizzling grease. The diner was nearly empty, occupied only by a few exhausted night shift workers nursing ceramic mugs at the laminate counter. I walked past the counter and guided Corey toward the back corner of the narrow room. We slid into a cramped, cracked vinyl booth. The heavily scratched Formica table was slightly sticky, illuminated by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb hanging directly overhead. This specific dilapidated booth was the exact location where my entire empire had originated. I looked across the scratched table at Corey and broke the heavy silence. I explained that exactly 40 years ago, after facing a brutal string of racially motivated rejections from elite downtown banks, I had retreated to this very diner. I had sat in this exact, cracked vinyl seat, completely exhausted and entirely out of options. I had ordered a 50-cent cup of black coffee, borrowed a cheap ballpoint pen from a sympathetic waitress, and meticulously sketched out my very first holding company business plan on the back of a thin paper napkin. I had built the initial architecture of a multi-million-dollar empire on this sticky Formica surface. The stark, undeniable contrast between our current astronomical net worth and the worn, peeling fabric of the booth was profoundly sobering. It completely stripped away the toxic arrogance we had absorbed during the Hastings ordeal. Order, fundamental humility, and basic human dignity were instantly and fully restored to our lives. A tired waitress wearing a faded yellow apron approached our table. She did not offer a rehearsed sycophantic greeting. She simply pulled a worn notepad from her pocket and asked what we wanted to eat. I ordered 2 simple plates of barbecued ribs and 2 mugs of strong black coffee. The waitress nodded curtly, jotted down the order, and walked back toward the swinging kitchen doors. Corey leaned back against the cracked vinyl, his shoulders finally dropping their rigid, defensive posture. He looked around the diner, absorbing the stark, unapologetic reality of the working-class environment. The immense psychological armor he had worn for 8 brutal months was officially decommissioned. The food arrived 10 minutes later on thick, chipped ceramic plates. We ate in complete, comfortable silence. The meat was tough and the coffee was scalding hot. It was the most satisfying meal we had consumed in nearly a year. We finished our plates, allowing the profound simplicity of the moment to wash away the lingering residue of Megan's vicious extortion attempt. The waitress returned, dropping a small handwritten paper receipt onto the center of the table. I did not reach for my thick leather wallet. I did not produce an exclusive heavy titanium credit card with an unlimited limit. I reached into the front pocket of my trousers and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, flattening the worn paper currency against the scratched Formica. There were no flashing cameras waiting outside. There were no sycophantic guests offering fake smiles. There were no massive contracts hanging in the balance. The silent foundational adjustment was completely absolute. We stood up, walked past the counter, and exited the diner into the cold Chicago night, leaving the elite world permanently behind us. If you found this story compelling and insightful, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more intense life stories and hard-earned lessons, and hit the like button if you appreciate true justice.